Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Alisha Canales McGuire. On September 20th, 2017, around 1:55 a.m., a series of events unfolded in Everett, Washington. Multiple people dialed 911 after being startled by loud bangs. 10 minutes after the initial calls, police officers arrived at the scene, where they were met with a horrific sight. 24-year-old Alisha Canales McGuire lay dead on the doorstep, just outside the door. Investigators cracked this heartbreaking case thanks to social media and CCTV footage. Born on October 29, 1992 in Mount Vernon, Washington, Alisha was the daughter of Manuel and Michelle Canales. Throughout her adult life, she worked as a caregiver, driven by her passion for helping others. Raised on a farm, Alisha started working at the age of 5, which instilled in her the value of hard work. She often returned to the family farm to lend a hand. Alisha cherished family time, regularly visiting and speaking with her loved ones, never failing to express her love when bidding them farewell. Alisha lived in Birdsview with her husband Bradley. The couple got married in a beautiful beach ceremony at Deception Pass in July 2017. However, the investigators soon discovered that Alisha didn't reside in the house where she died. Instead, it was her sister Amanda Canales' home, where Amanda lived with her 3 kids. Amanda had a work commitment in New York and asked Alisha to take care of her children during her absence. Alisha, who adored her nephew and nieces, was more than happy to help out. There was a staying nanny in the house with her, and she was one of those who called 911. She woke up to the sound of gunshots, and when she went downstairs, she saw that Alisha was lying at the front door and not moving. The police officers who arrived at the scene took immediate action, beginning with a thorough examination of the house to rule out the possibility that the perpetrator was still inside. They conducted a meticulous search, confirming that only the nanny and Amanda's children were present in the house. Once the frightened children had been safely removed from the house, the police commenced their investigation for evidence. A car parked in front of the house caught their attention, with shell casings discovered nearby, indicating that the shooter had been standing beside the vehicle, just before the front door. Several bullets had hit the door frame, and Alisha's lifeless body was found lying face down, right outside the door. It didn't resemble a robbery. The house was tidy, and it seemed as though the perpetrator hadn't even stepped inside. But who would want Alisha dead, and what could be the motive behind it? When the detectives found out that it was her sister's house, they began to suspect that it was a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps Amanda was the target, but she was in New York when the crime occurred. The nanny, a witness who was present in the house at the time of the crime, provided a calm and coherent account to the investigators. During questioning, she explained that she was upstairs when she heard the sound of gunshots. Upon looking down, she saw Alisha lying face down on the floor, motionless. However, she did not see the perpetrator of the shooting. Startled, the nanny immediately called 911. The nanny gave the police the first crucial lead. She reported that Amanda, Alisha's sister, had problems with her ex-husband, Kevin Lewis. The detectives pored over the reports from the local sheriff's office and discovered that this was not the first time someone had called the police to that address. Every prior incident involved domestic disputes between Amanda and Kevin Lewis, which caught the detectives' attention. They obtained Kevin Lewis's home address, situated in a different part of Everett, and paid him a visit before dawn to conduct an interview. Although his house was shrouded in darkness, Kevin responded to their knock on the door. During the conversation, the officers asked Kevin if he knew where his ex-wife was, and he replied that she should be at home. He looked like he had just woken up. The detectives asked him to tell them where he had spent the night, and he said he had been at home all night, with his sister and mother able to confirm this. He didn't ask what was the reason for the detectives' visit. When the detectives told Kevin about the shooting at his children's residence, he remained impassive, which raised suspicions. A typical parent would have asked about their children's well-being, but Kevin didn't. The detectives then informed Kevin that Amanda was out of town on business, to which he reacted with apparent surprise, saying, "Really?" Next, the detectives investigated neighboring houses and discovered that 2 of them had surveillance cameras that could corroborate or contradict Kevin's alibi. The footage revealed that Kevin's claim of staying home all night was false. A car was seen pulling up to his driveway approximately 40 minutes before the attack on Alisha. The footage showed someone resembling Kevin leaving the house, entering the car, and driving away. Although the recording quality was poor, the police couldn't positively identify the individual. A closer review of footage from another camera provided additional details about the car. While they couldn't identify the vehicle's make, they noticed that the front right rim was a different color from the other 3 light-colored rims. The car returned to Kevin's neighborhood about 20 minutes before the 911 calls reporting the shooting started. The person who had entered the car earlier returned to the house and went back inside. Amanda learned about her sister Alisha's death a few hours later, while she was in New York. When the investigators asked Amanda if she thought her ex-husband Kevin could have been the one who shot Alisha, she replied that she had no doubt it was him. Even though their 8-year marriage had ended, Amanda was still not ready to fully acknowledge how toxic the relationship with her ex-husband had been. Amanda was deeply unhappy throughout their marriage. Even after their divorce in June 2017, Kevin's threats continued to intimidate her. He had physically abused her in the past, and despite their separation, he remained a threat. After the divorce, Amanda was awarded full custody of their 3 children, and Kevin was ordered to pay $800 monthly in child support. However, he repeatedly violated the restraining order, showing up outside her home and terrifying both Amanda and their children. Despite these violations, the police never charged Kevin with any crime. Amanda suffered a severe beating in her driveway just a few weeks before her sister's death. One night, she arrived home late and parked her car next to her house. As she opened the door, someone attacked her. The assault happened so quickly that she didn't get a glimpse of the attacker's face. Nevertheless, she was certain who was responsible: Kevin Lewis, 30, who would later become the prime suspect in the murder of Alisha Canales McGuire, Amanda's sister. The investigators believed that he intended to take the life of his ex-wife. Kevin did not know that she was in New York during that time, and he didn't know that Amanda had asked Alisha to look after her children while she was away. However, there was an inconsistency in this theory. If the man in the footage was really Kevin, it meant he was at his house at the time of the shooting. In addition, his sister and mother provided him with an alibi. The police continued their investigation, exploring various explanations for what had occurred. They revisited Amanda's house to re-examine the scene, including the path the bullets took. According to experts, Alisha was shot when the door was ajar, and the shooter fired at least 7 times, with the shots coming from outside the house and entering it. The evidence gathered at the scene suggested that the shooter stood next to the garage, firing initially, before moving towards the door and firing again from inside it. The medical examiner identified the cause of Alisha's death as multiple gunshot wounds to the head and torso. She got struck by 5 shots, and 2 of the wounds showed gunpowder stippling injury. The medical examiner testified that he could not determine the sequence of the 5 shots, but said that the last 2 gunshot wounds to the head were probably the last 2 wounds inflicted. According to the experts, the 7 shell casings found at the crime scene were fired from the same firearm, and the bullet wounds to Alisha's head were inflicted at close range. The investigators analyzed this theory, but didn't find any evidence confirming this. The shell casings found at the crime scene also attracted the attention of the police because this brand of casings was not very common. They were Russian-made casings manufactured under the Tulamo brand. Since it was not a very common brand, The investigators hoped they would identify the seller of these cartridges and maybe even the buyer. The investigators found that Walmart had sold .40 caliber cartridges of a specific brand, with one of the stores located near the crime scene. Walmart representatives informed the detectives that a man had recently bought 9mm Tulamo cartridges, and they had CCTV footage of the transaction. The detectives promptly visited Walmart to review the footage, which was recorded on September 18th, 2 days prior to Alisha's death. They initially suspected that Kevin Lewis might be the buyer, but they were mistaken. The man in the footage was not Kevin, and he had paid using a credit card. The investigators looked into this individual and discovered no connection to Kevin Lewis, Amanda, or the nanny, forcing them to search for new evidence. After thoroughly examining all the existing theories, the investigators approached Amanda to gather new information about Kevin. Initially, Amanda stated that their relationship was okay during the honeymoon phase, but Kevin's behavior gradually became more aggressive, culminating in physical abuse. Their tumultuous relationship ultimately ended in divorce, with a restraining order issued against Kevin and Amanda gaining full custody of their children. Despite her emotional distress, Amanda firmly believed that Alisha's death was a case of mistaken identity, convinced that the intended target was actually herself. She suspected that Lewis had orchestrated the attack, but the police found that Kevin had a solid alibi, as he was at home during the time of the shooting. The investigators have again reviewed the footage taken on the night of Alisha's death. Now they noticed something they hadn't noticed before. This low-quality recording shows Kevin, or the man who left his house, walking up to the car and getting into the back seat behind the driver. But why didn't he get into the front passenger seat? In search of an answer, the investigators concluded that someone else was already sitting in the front passenger seat. Therefore, by the time the car pulled up to Kevin Lewis's house, there were probably already 2 people in it, and perhaps that's why he had to sit in the back seat. The police had no evidence to link Kevin to Alisha's death. However, they gathered evidence of Kevin's attacks on his ex-wife Amanda and arrested him in November 2018. The court sentenced him to 3 years in prison. More than a year had passed since Alisha's death, but the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough finally occurred when a woman contacted the police station with crucial information. She provided a tip that a girl who lived in nearby Spokane had been overheard bragging at a party about being hired to kill someone on York Road, the same road where Alisha was fatally shot. Although the police were initially skeptical, given that Spokane is about 5 hours away from Everett, they decided to investigate further. The woman who called said she was at a party where she met a young woman who introduced herself as Angelica. The latter bragged about how she and her boyfriend participated in the crime. According to this woman, Angelica said someone died because of a shot in the head, and they were shooting from around the corner and were hired by the children's father. Moreover, Angelica said they took the wrong person's life. It was a case of mistaken identity. The police never publicly disclosed the details of this case, but investigators and family members were aware that Alisha had been fatally shot in the head. Since Angelica possessed knowledge of the crime's specifics, the police became intrigued by her information. During their search for Angelica, investigators discovered that her real name was Alexis Hail. On her social media, they found photos of her posing with a 9mm pistol, which may have been the murder weapon. Additionally, there were several videos showing a man in the background, later identified as Alexis's boyfriend, Jedon Phelps. On the night of Alisha's death, Alexis Hail posted a video filmed through the windshield of a car, analyzing the road signs. The investigators determined the exact location of this car at that moment. It was about a 10-minute drive from Kevin Lewis's house. In the following video taken a few hours after Alisha's death, Jedon Phelps bragged about a wad of money. The investigators saw 5 comments under Phelps's photo on social media, and one of the comments was from his aunt, whom they recognized as Kevin Lewis's mother. It turned out that Jedon Phelps was Kevin's cousin. The police had sufficient evidence to make arrests. The first person they detained was Alexis Hail, who was 17 years old. As the officers handcuffed her, she protested, claiming they had no right to arrest her due to her age, yet she seemed aware of the reasons behind her arrest. She promptly requested a lawyer. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, the police took Jedon Phelps into custody. The investigators used Phelps and Hale's phone records to show that they had driven from Spokane to Everett to carry out the shooting. Security footage from Lewis's neighbors showed someone getting into a car in the early hours of September 20th. The man in a white top left at 11:13 a.m. and returned at 1:37 a.m. When the police went to see Lewis after Alisha's death, he was wearing a white top. Alexis remained silent with the investigators. At the time, Kevin Lewis, now known as Kevin, was serving a 3-year prison sentence for assaulting Amanda. The investigators turned to Phelps, the one who had arranged the crime, hoping to gather information. As they suspected, Phelps confessed and revealed the name of the man who had hired him, Kevin Lewis. The police took Phelps to the crime scene where he provided further details of the crime. Phelps initially just showed them where the house was, and they were taking him back to his home. Later, when they went back, Phelps showed them the area where he was standing, and he described how Alisha opened the door slightly, and as Lexi was walking towards them, Phelps started shooting at the door. Alisha closed the door, and Phelps opened it and fired a few more shots. Kevin Lewis, who was already in jail on an unrelated charge, was arrested on charges of aggravated murder with a firearm, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder for the September 2017 death of Alisha Canales McGuire. In July 2020, Phelps, who was then 20, pleaded guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, and the court sentenced him to 31 years in prison. Hail, who was then 18, pleaded guilty to the same charge and got 15 years. Phelps testified at the trial that he had committed the crime for money and the street cred. He claimed he had spent the money Lewis paid him to get some tattoos, a pair of Timberland boots, and a Ferragamo belt buckle. He also claimed his former girlfriend had got the pistol from a family member. Lewis pleaded not guilty and faced a trial later that year. The prosecution said that he had paid $2,400 to his cousin and his girlfriend to get his ex-wife out of the way, turning them into teenage assassins. But in a tragic case of mistaken identity, it had been Alisha who had opened the door. Phelps said Lewis had directed them to the home, but claimed he didn't know who the target was, just the address. On the way back, Lewis handed Phelps an envelope of money after dropping Lewis back at his residence. Phelps and Hale returned to the location Lewis had pointed out, and Phelps fired the gun until it was empty, starting from his position near the garage, and fired the last couple after walking up to the front porch. The muzzle of the gun crossed the threshold. The last couple of shots were around the neck and head area. Phelps and Hale left in their car, but then returned because they believed they might have left a glove at the scene. When they returned, they saw police cars, so they turned around and left. They accessed GPS directions and drove back to Spokane. The defense argued that Lewis had never actually used the word kill when talking to his cousin and had simply said to get the target out of the way. But the prosecution reminded the court of Kevin's history of violence and the threats he'd made against Amanda. In November 2021, Lewis was found guilty of first-degree murder by a jury following a 6-week trial that lasted less than 3.5 hours. In January 2022, at the age of 34, Kevin was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. As part of the sentence, Judge Thompson prohibited Lewis from having any contact with his ex-wife, children, Phelps, and Hale for the remainder of his life. According to records, Lewis is currently serving his sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla County. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. As the police started their search, they encountered a series of unexpected twists that no one could have predicted. Eventually, the detectives managed to uncover the truth about the girl's fate, but no one was ready for it. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella in Missouri. Later, her mom met a man named David, and they got married. Colleen had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their wedding, she and David had a daughter together. Altogether, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and they shared a very close bond. She spent a lot of time outdoors, riding her bike around town, enjoying swimming, and indulging in her passion for drawing. She also liked going to Sunday school at the local church, where she always volunteered to help other kids who had some issues with their tasks. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old and in the 4th grade at the local elementary school, her mom worked the night shift at a store, while her stepdad spent most of the day on the farm. This left Rowan often fending for herself, which made her very independent. On November 2nd, she stayed home alone as usual. Her mom went to work, and her stepdad hadn't returned from the farm yet. The next morning around 9 a.m., Colleen came home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but her daughter wasn't there. She asked her husband where her daughter was. He said she had asked him if she could have a sleepover at a friend's house, and he had let her go. He didn't even ask the friend's name because their town was very small, and he wasn't worried about anything happening to her. But Colleen started to worry and decided to check with all of Rowan's friends. Since there were only a few streets in their town, it didn't take long, but none of them had seen her, and she hadn't stayed over at any of their houses, which made her mother even more concerned. Colleen searched the whole town but couldn't find her daughter. She went back home and told her husband that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She asked him to call the police and report her missing, but he reassured her that everything was fine and that she would come home soon. After waiting for several more hours with no sign of Rowan, Colleen took matters into her own hands and dialed 911 herself. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to their house to speak with David, as he was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with his colleague Christopher, their mutual friend Nathan came by. They all decided to go to David's place to have some drinks and play pool. They stopped by the store, bought some alcohol, and went to David's house, where they spent several hours. Later in the night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town where his trailer was, and they persuaded David to join them to continue the fun. Before leaving the house, he checked on Rowan in her room, seeing that she was asleep. David left with his friends, stopped by the store again, grabbed more alcohol, and headed to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. After that, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to give him a ride. Nathan agreed, but chose to take back roads instead of the main highway. By that time, he was quite drunk and didn't want to risk encountering the police. Nathan dropped him off and drove home, while David went straight to bed. Soon after, he was awakened by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and fell back asleep. Police approached this story with some skepticism. What puzzled them most was the fact that a 9-year-old girl decided to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and her stepfather let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The sheriff considered that David might be hiding something or directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Police searched the town and its surroundings until late at night. Local residents immediately joined the search, as they all knew Rowan's family and wanted to help. The population of Stella was only about 150 people, so news of her disappearance spread throughout the county almost instantly. People were used to being able to let their children play outside without a worry, as nothing ever happened in such a quiet place. But now, Rowan had vanished without a trace, and the police were unable to find her. For a whole day, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The first day of the search yielded no results. On November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town to speak with Christopher, who fully corroborated David's story. However, Christopher added that his friend hadn't even contacted him since that evening, and he had only just found out about Rowan's disappearance on the same day. The police expanded the search and involved even more volunteers, but they still couldn't find Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation while the local police continued to search for Rowan throughout the town and its surroundings. Detectives focused on exploring the possibility of abduction. They strongly doubted the stepfather's story, as it seemed highly questionable. Police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she hadn't visited any of them that night. Investigators continued to speak with David, and he changed certain details in his story several times, further raising suspicions against him. For instance, he gave conflicting timelines for his absence from home that night, and even said that perhaps Rowan hadn't asked him for permission to go to her friend's house and just left without his knowledge. FBI agents also discovered that on the night of her disappearance, David had asked his mother to borrow her car, a fact he had initially not disclosed to the police. As a result, they decided to seize both this car and his own pickup truck for examination, but experts were unable to uncover any evidence. Meanwhile, detectives decided to speak with Christopher and Nathan again, as they were both with David that evening. Police invited Christopher to the station. He repeated the same story as the day before. He also agreed to a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. Several hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he noticed Sheriff Clark's car and waved for him to stop. Sheriff Clark led the police department in their town called Witten and had known Christopher for 17 years since his childhood. The sheriff was friends with his foster parents, and Christopher always respected him. He often sought his advice or help in difficult times, such as when his mother passed away. Sheriff Clark approached Christopher, and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. The sheriff was aware of the case, but had not been involved in it, as the search was being handled by the Stella department. During their conversation, the sheriff felt that Christopher's behavior was quite weird, and he suspected that Christopher might be withholding some information from him. Considering that Rowan's life was at stake and her fate remained unknown, Clark decided to share his suspicions with the FBI. He contacted the agents and told them about his concerns. Investigators assumed that Christopher might be withholding some significant information that could implicate Rowan's stepfather in her disappearance. Perhaps he had asked Christopher to lie and change certain details in the story of that evening, and now Christopher feared being implicated as an accomplice if he told the truth. Sheriff Clark informed the FBI agents that he had a close and trusting relationship with Christopher, so he offered to help persuade him to talk. That same evening, Christopher went to Colleen's house to ask her if there was any progress in the search. About the same time, FBI agents also arrived to speak with Rowan's mother again. When they saw Christopher there, they also asked him some questions, and he once again repeated that the events of that evening unfolded exactly as he had previously said. But then he mentioned for the first time that he did not rule out the possibility of David's involvement in her disappearance, and said that he wanted to help them uncover the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. He even suggested wearing a wire and going to talk to David to try to coax him into confessing. But at that point, the detectives decided not to resort to such tactics. Instead, they asked Christopher if he had any locations in mind where his friend could have hidden Rowan's body, and he named several places. The next morning, police set out to search these locations as well as continuing their search in the surrounding areas of Stella. FBI agents once again brought David for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives searched his home in an attempt to find any leads, but it turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Christopher went to the sheriff's office to speak with Clark and told him about his encounter with the FBI. During their conversation, the sheriff had a strong feeling that Christopher was still withholding something. After their meeting, he contacted the detectives again and told them that Christopher might be keeping some information that could likely help them prove David's involvement. FBI agents asked the sheriff to continue trying to persuade him to talk, based on the fact that Christopher had repeatedly contacted Clark to discuss the case with him. They believed he wanted to share important information, but for some reason, he was afraid to do so. The next day, on November 7th, the police called Christopher back to the station. They needed his consent to search his safe, located in David's house. Christopher had been living with him for several months when he temporarily didn't have a place of his own, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave them his permission and also agreed to allow the police to search his trailer and his car. He also voluntarily provided them with a DNA sample and agreed to answer the detectives' questions again. They began questioning him about that evening, and once again asked him to confirm David's story. But this time, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story wasn't entirely true. The investigators began pressing him to tell them what really happened, but this pressure only caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and attempt to accuse him of involvement in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue this conversation. After that, detectives had to end the interrogation, and Christopher left the station. That same evening, he went to Sheriff Clark and told him about it. He complained that the detectives were treating him like a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The sheriff replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were just doing everything possible to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would no longer speak with them, and that if he wanted to share anything else, he would only speak with Clark. The sheriff continued to persuade Christopher to tell him everything he knew, and at some point, Christopher began to cry. He said that he always loved Rowan and would never harm her. During the time when he lived in David's house, he developed a close bond with Rowan and the other children. They began to treat him like a family member and even called him Uncle Christopher. The sheriff understood that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to speak, someone arrived at the police station, distracting Sheriff Clark for some time. Christopher left the office without sharing what he had intended to. Sheriff Clark reached out to the FBI again and told them about this conversation. He explained that Christopher was almost ready to disclose everything he knew, but cautioned that pushing him too hard might cause him to stop talking and get an attorney. Clark suggested giving Christopher some time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day, again with no luck, but everything changed on November 9th, a week after her disappearance. Search groups reached a remote area near a town called Powell, 10 miles from Stella. There, amidst fields and trees, they discovered a large pit in the ground. When they looked there, they found Rowan's body concealed under leaves and debris. She was missing all clothing below the waist, except for one sock. Medical experts found signs of strangulation and also determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body's discovery, FBI agents contacted Sheriff Clark and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would now reveal everything. Sheriff learned that earlier that morning, Christopher had visited the station when he wasn't there and informed other officers that he needed to speak urgently with Clark. The sheriff set out to search for Christopher, checking all the places where he might be, but the man was nowhere to be found. It continued until Christopher called Clark himself. He was clearly distressed and asked if he was being followed. He explained that after hearing the news about Rowan's body being found, he drove around town to clear his head and noticed a gray car tailing him. Sheriff Clark replied that he knew nothing about any surveillance and suggested meeting Christopher in person. When they met, Christopher was visibly nervous and expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after Rowan's body was discovered, he might be accused of murder, and someone might seek revenge against him. Clark took him to the station and said that now that the case had been classified as a homicide, it was time to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began crying again, and the sheriff asked him to tell what David had done to Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that there were too many people at the police station and he didn't want to discuss it there. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge located a few miles from their town. Clark agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher unexpectedly raised his hands and said that the sheriff should handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and replied that it wasn't necessary, but Christopher insisted, saying, "After what I tell you, you'll have to do it." After this, he began talking. Christopher repeated the first part of the story he had told the police many times. He, along with Nathan and David, went to his trailer where they continued drinking. Sometime later, his friends decided to head home, and David asked Nathan for a ride. They said they would take back roads to avoid the police and left. But then Christopher started telling something that shocked the sheriff to the core. He claimed that he wanted to sexually assault Rowan and quickly came up with a plan. Knowing his friends would take quite some time on the road through the fields, he got into his car and drove straight to David's house, taking the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to his car, doing it all so that she wouldn't wake up. After that, he took her to his trailer where he assaulted her. According to him, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't break free. Christopher didn't turn on the lights or speak to her because he didn't want Rowan to recognize him. After the crime, he planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as planned. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly and she saw his face. Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled her. When she passed away, he loaded her body into the car and started thinking about what to do next. At first, he wanted to dump her from the bridge, the same one where he stood with Sheriff Clark, but Christopher realized that her body would be found too quickly. So, he got behind the wheel and began driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered the large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dumped the body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large, so everything fell down. When he returned to the trailer, he found traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. Christopher also realized he needed to get rid of her pants, underwear, and the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention, so he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Clark was completely taken aback by this story. All this time, he thought David had committed the crime, and Christopher was just withholding some information. It was hard for him to believe that the man he had known for almost 20 years was capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had 3 young children, and although he didn't live with them after divorcing his wife, he always seemed like a decent man to him. But reality turned out to be way more chilling. After Christopher finished his story, he agreed to voluntarily go to the station, and the sheriff didn't handcuff him. Only after they arrived and the man repeated his confession to the FBI agents, he was arrested on charges of murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent to search his trailer and car. Ending his confession, he added that he regretted his actions and said that he cried like a baby all the next day. The detectives immediately went to speak with David and informed him that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Considering David's strange behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been covering for his friend. However, they were met with an even more shocking twist. When David was brought in for questioning, he suddenly changed his version of events. According to him, the night he returned home and found Rowan missing from her room, he realized that Christopher might have taken her. So, he took his mother's car and drove to his trailer. Upon entering, he saw the girl on the bed with Christopher leaning over her. Instead of rescuing Rowan, David decided to join in. He also sexually assaulted her. Then he helped his friend kill her and dispose of the body. David added that during the ordeal, his brain simply shut off, and he remembered nothing about the night for several days. The detectives, who were not expecting such a twist, went back to Christopher to confirm David's words. However, Christopher stated that his friend was not involved and that everything happened as he had told them. This further baffled the detectives, but Christopher's story matched the facts. Medical experts confirmed that the victim had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail only the killer would know. During a search of the trailer, the police found a barrel with ashes. In his car, they also discovered hair comparable to Rowan's. Despite investigators still being unable to confidently determine whose version of events was truthful, both men provided incriminating statements. So David was also arrested, and the cases were sent to court. During the trial, Christopher filed a motion to exclude all his statements from the case materials, claiming he was unaware they could be used against him and that the police violated his rights. But the judge denied this motion since all his conversations with investigators were entirely voluntary. Christopher also attempted to plead mitigating circumstances, pointing out his difficult childhood. From an early age, he was constantly shuffled between biological and foster parents, which greatly impacted him. Christopher also invited an expert who claimed he had signs of developmental issues, but none of this helped him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal this sentence, but to no avail. As for David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to assaulting and killing Rowan, but there was one serious problem. His version contradicted Christopher's statements. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, it could potentially lead to Christopher's sentence being overturned, and David might also avoid responsibility. Considering there was no solid evidence against David, such as DNA, the prosecution could not take such a risk. In fact, they still weren't sure if he was involved at all. The prosecution did not rule out the possibility that David might have indeed committed the crime together with Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made. To avoid the risk of Christopher's sentence being overturned, they reduced David's charges to much lighter ones. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges: child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to be served behind bars. This sentence was met with outrage. If David was indeed involved in the murder, his punishment was deemed incomparable to the severity of the crime. However, there's nothing that can be done about it now, and it's unlikely that he will ever be tried again for this case. As for Christopher, he remains in prison awaiting execution. Considering that decades often pass between sentencing and execution, there are no guarantees that the death penalty will ever be carried out. It's quite possible that he will simply spend the rest of his life in prison. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Lisa Holm was born on February 7, 1998, in the small Swedish town of Jo, where she had a peaceful upbringing with her parents and older sister. Known for her kindness, positivity, and determination, Lisa decided early on that she wanted to study architecture in Australia. Growing up, she traveled extensively with her family, visiting many countries around the world. As an independent young woman, Lisa worked various part-time jobs since her teenage years to earn her own money. Before the summer of 2015, 17-year-old Lisa secured her first serious job at a cafe located approximately a 40-minute drive from her home. Initially, her parents drove her to work, but after a few weeks, her father decided to purchase a scooter for her. However, during the first few weeks, her father followed her in his scooter to ensure her safety, given her limited experience driving on the roads. As Lisa only worked on weekends, her father accompanied her every morning and evening during this period. This went on until June 7th, when he finally let her drive to the cafe alone. Somewhere around lunchtime, her parents decided to visit her at work and have lunch together that day. The cafe was pretty crowded, so Lisa was really busy with work. She took a short break for lunch, had a snack with her parents, and they went back home. At 6:23 p.m., Lisa sent a text message to her father informing him that she was leaving work. However, just 3 minutes later, her father received a call from her. When he answered the phone, there was no response from the other end. Instead, he could hear some indistinct voices in the background, leading him to believe that Lisa had accidentally dialed his number. He assumed she was engaged in a conversation with her colleagues. Additionally, he heard the sound of a scooter door being closed forcefully. He repeatedly called out Lisa's name, but there was still no answer. Eventually, he ended the call and began waiting for Lisa to arrive home. However, she never showed up. An hour passed, and Lisa's parents started to worry. She should have arrived by now, so her father immediately thought something might have happened to her on the way. It was her first time riding alone on the scooter, and he was deeply concerned about her safety. He tried calling her several times, but Lisa's phone was off. After waiting a few more minutes, her father decided to hit the road, hoping to meet her along the way since Lisa should have taken the shortest route. The father, concerned that Lisa might have met with an accident, drove slowly, meticulously examining the road, but couldn't find her anywhere. He reached the cafe without any success in locating his daughter. As he arrived at her workplace, he noticed Lisa's scooter parked in front of the building. By this point, the man was already panic-stricken, having failed to find her along the entire route. The sight of her scooter provided immediate relief, making him think that she might have been held up at work for some reason. However, the cafe was empty, and he noticed something unusual. Lisa's scooter keys were still in the ignition, with her helmet hanging from the handle. This observation led him to suspect that something unfortunate might have happened to his daughter, as she would never carelessly leave the keys in the scooter and abandon it unattended in the parking lot. Meanwhile, Lisa's mother called the cafe owner in hopes of shedding light on her daughter's whereabouts, but the woman claimed to have no idea where she could have gone. She had called her employees around 6 p.m., and they said they were closing the cafe. After the call from Lisa's mother, the cafe owner immediately got into her scooter and headed there. On the way, she called 4 of her friends who lived nearby and asked them to help with the search. When the cafe owner arrived at the scene, they, along with Lisa's father, began searching both the establishment itself and the surrounding area. Their last hope was that Lisa, for some reason, might have decided to take a bus instead of the scooter. They checked the schedule, and her mother, along with Lisa's older sister, drove to the bus stop in their town. Unfortunately, this version was not confirmed. Lisa was not on the bus, so her relatives immediately contacted the police by that time. It was almost 1 p.m. and it had already gotten dark outside. The police immediately launched extensive searches. The fact that Lisa's scooter was left in the parking lot with the keys led them to consider the possibility of abduction. Cases like this are quite rare in Sweden, especially in the remote provincial area where Lisa's town was located. Therefore, the police immediately dispatched several groups with search dogs, while other officers began knocking on every house located near the cafe. When Lisa's classmates and her friends learned about her disappearance, they began spreading information about it on social media, hoping to attract more attention and possibly find some witnesses. The search continued all night, but it yielded no results. On Monday morning, the police publicly announced Lisa's disappearance and urged anyone with useful information to come forward. Around the same time, a man working in a barn directly opposite the cafe discovered a motorcycle glove on the floor and reported it to the police. The investigators had already inspected this barn on the evening of Lisa's disappearance, but had not noticed the glove there. They showed it to Lisa's parents, who confirmed that the glove did indeed belong to their daughter. This further substantiated the abduction theory, and the police deployed additional resources for the search. By then, news of Lisa's disappearance had spread nationwide, and hundreds of volunteers had joined the search effort. On Tuesday, the police received several more disturbing clues. Volunteers searched the area along a dirt road located a short distance from the cafe. There, they discovered a phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and a shattered smartphone screen. Investigators quickly determined that all of these items belonged to Lisa and concentrated their search in that vicinity. Soon after, they found additional pieces of the broken smartphone, Lisa's identification, and more receipts. All of these items were dispersed along the same dirt road. After the discovery of evidence, the police were almost certain that Lisa had been abducted. They put everything into the search, and more people joined with each passing day. The case became the biggest news in Sweden, and hundreds of volunteers poured in from all over the country. A local organization specializing in finding missing persons also joined in. The search effort for Lisa became the largest in the country's modern history, with over 1,000 participants in total. The police also received numerous calls with leads. One woman reported that she went out for a run the day before Lisa's disappearance. At one point, a man standing next to his scooter stopped her in the middle of the road. He spoke to her in English and asked for directions to a city she had never heard of. She tried to show him the way on Google Maps, but the man asked her to get in his scooter and show him the route on his navigator. The woman found this request quite suspicious, so she refused and continued running. She also shared an interesting detail with the police. The woman believed she had seen this man among the workers who were repairing the same barn located across the road from the cafe. Lisa's colleagues also shared one observation. On the day of her disappearance, one of the witnesses noticed two men standing across the road from the cafe, looking towards the establishment. She didn't think much of it at the time, but after Lisa's disappearance, she decided to share this fact with the police. The next morning on Wednesday, Lisa's father, along with some friends, went to search the dirt road where her belongings were found. Walking a bit further, he made several more alarming discoveries. He found Lisa's driver's license and her house keys. It all seemed as if Lisa was being taken along this road away from the cafe, while the abductor was throwing her belongings out of their scooter or other vehicle they used to kidnap her. The police and volunteers concentrated all their efforts on this area, but no other items were found. That same evening, a friend of Lisa's father was returning home from the search. Passing by the cafe, he noticed that the police tape had been removed from the barn where Lisa's glove was found. The man decided to go inside and look for any other clues once more. He grabbed a flashlight from his scooter, as it was already getting dark outside, and walked around the premises for several minutes until something shiny on the floor caught his attention. When he looked closer, he saw a woman's earring and another one just like it nearby. The man reported this to the police, who showed the earrings to Lisa's parents. They confirmed that the earrings belonged to their daughter. The police once again sealed off the barn and searched it more thoroughly. The lead detective later explained that on the first day of Lisa's search, their main focus was on finding the girl herself, so the barn was not inspected as thoroughly. They might have missed such small items as earrings, but now they brought in numerous forensic experts along with search dogs. This time, they spotted an odd clue behind a wall: human poop. Forensic experts say when crooks do terrible crimes, their body makes lots of adrenaline, sometimes making them need to go real bad. Like killers often wet themselves before or during the murder. Since Lisa's stuff was in the barn, cops think the perp might have took her there. So, they reckon this person, all hopped up on adrenaline, and couldn't hold it. The poop got sent off for DNA testing. On Friday, the search area was expanded and volunteers reached a farm about 3 kilometers from the cafe. It was a facility with several large buildings where many people worked. The search team decided to inspect all the buildings. Shortly after arriving, 2 English-speaking men showed up. One claimed that the police had already searched the farm, but the team leader doubted this and continued the search. The men observed the volunteers for a while before driving away. The other day, the search team found a pile of wood behind the cowshed. Underneath, they found a helmet, a coat, and a motorcycle headset. The police arrived on site and confirmed that all these items belonged to Lisa. They sent police experts to conduct a more extensive search of the farm. Detectives also heard stories about two strange men who had tried to discourage volunteers from inspecting the farm. The police also recalled the story of a woman who had met a suspicious man while she was jogging. Meanwhile, forensic experts arrived at the farm together with the volunteers. They continued to inspect this area, and soon their attention was drawn to an old trailer. It was surrounded by tall grass and looked as if it hadn't been used in many years. But next to its door, the grass was flattened as if something had been lying there recently. Some of the grass was also trapped under the door, indicating that it had been recently opened. As soon as the forensic experts opened the door, they were immediately met with a strong smell of decay. Inside the trailer, there were many lockers for clothing. Apparently, it was once used as a changing room for workers. All the lockers except one were locked, leading the experts to suspect that Lisa's body might be in one of them. They began opening each locker and eventually saw that Lisa's body was actually in one that was left open, hidden behind a pile of old clothes and rags. Despite the small size of the locker, the perpetrator managed to fit their victim inside. Lisa had a rope around her neck and a large amount of tape over her head. Her pants were pulled down and her shirt was pulled up. Medical experts determined that Lisa died from strangulation. However, they found no signs of sexual assault. All of her clothing was handed over to the lab, while news of the discovery of her body rapidly spread throughout the country. All this time, the news of Lisa's abduction dominated headlines in Sweden. When her body was found and the public learned of Lisa's brutal murder, the case shook the entire country. Such crimes were extremely rare in Sweden, and people were shocked that someone could commit such a heinous act. The Lisa body been discover, something way day eerie happen. YouTube users come see one video we dem post 13 days before the murder. The video name na 13, and he get countdown timer. The name of the channel we post them sef they worry people, them call him Lisa home. News of the video spread well, people come day surprised. Some people talk say somebody don't predict the murder, but no be so. Now just be like say, person changed the channel name and video title after them find Lisa body. Maybe the person just wants start a notatory or they play wicked prank. Meanwhile, the police were doing everything in their power to find the killer as quickly as possible. At the time of Lisa's discovery, investigators had already brought in two brothers and a woman, and they all denied any involvement in the murder. They claimed that at the time of the abduction, they were at home, providing alibis for each other. According to their accounts, the older brother, Naris, was asleep in his room while his wife was preparing dinner, and the younger brother was on the computer. Naris also added that around 8 p.m. he woke up and went to the gas station, where he bought pizza and cigarettes. The police were pretty skeptical of their alibis, as all three could have simply been covering for each other. They collected their DNA samples, but investigators still lacked any evidence directly linking any of them to the murder. However, this didn't last long. Forensic experts were working in the barn and on the farm, using all their resources and manpower, and their efforts soon paid off. In the barn, there was a small office-like room with a large window overlooking the cafe. While examining this room, experts found 15 traces of semen from men on the walls near the window and on the floor. It seemed as if someone had stood there, watched the cafe staff, including Lisa, and pleasured himself. The semen samples were immediately sent to the laboratory, and experts quickly extracted DNA profiles from them. All 15 semen traces matched the DNA of 35-year-old brother Naris. The same was true for the feces found in the barn. They also belonged to him. In the next room, which had previously been used for storing cow's milk, forensic experts noticed a pipe about 2 feet above the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a small strip. The size of this strip perfectly matched the rope used to strangle Lisa. Traces of blood were also found on this pipe, and the DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Naris. On the floor beneath the pipe, they discovered a piece of the same rope. Experts examined it and identified 2 DNA profiles, Lisa's and Naris's. This was a significant breakthrough for the police. It finally linked the man to the rope used to kill the victim. Furthermore, a hair belonging to Lisa was found on the floor of this room. Another crucial piece of evidence came from her jacket. DNA traces belonging to Naris were also found on it. Based on this evidence, the police believed that she was killed right there. They pieced together an approximate sequence of events. Naris had been observing the cafe for some time, and when Lisa was alone in the parking lot, he approached her. Based on the jogger's account, he could have asked Lisa for directions to a certain city or used some other tactics. Then, Naris might have asked her to get into his scooter to enter the route into the GPS system. Considering Lisa was kind-hearted and always tried to help others, she might have agreed. Once she was in the scooter, the perpetrator taped her mouth shut and drove her to the barn. There, he wrapped the rope around her neck and hung her from the pipe. According to the medical experts, this sight likely excited him so much that he defecated on the floor due to an adrenaline rush. When she died, he placed Lisa's body in the scooter and drove to the farm, tossing her belongings out the window along the way. There, he hid the body in the trailer locker, covering it with old clothes scattered around. All of this, from the moment of the abduction, took the perpetrator less than an hour. Despite all the evidence, Naris continued to insist on his innocence. His wife and younger brother had to be released because there was nothing against them. Once free, they almost immediately left Sweden and returned to their homeland, Lithuania. The preparation for the trial was intense. Naris just claimed he had worked in that barn for a long time, suggesting his DNA could have been present there due to his job. Additionally, he had an alibi provided by his wife and brother, although there were serious doubts about the credibility of both sources. In court, this could have definitely worked in his favor. On the other hand, the presence of Naris's DNA on the victim's clothing could only be explained by direct contact with her on the day of the murder. The police also found a witness who saw his scooter near the cafe shortly before and after Lisa's abduction. According to them, the scooter passed along the road between the cafe and the farm several times at the same time when Naris was supposed to be sleeping at home, according to his brother and wife. For several months after the discovery of her body, experts continued to examine all the available evidence using the most advanced equipment. Eventually, they uncovered traces of Naris's DNA on almost all of Lisa's clothing, including the inside of her underwear. Considering that the whole country was still following the case, investigators continued to search for any other useful clues that could impact the legal process and further prove Naris's involvement. They even went to Lithuania to speak with his wife and brother once again. The woman continued to insist that he did not leave the house between 6 and 8 p.m. But when it was the younger brother's turn, detectives suddenly got what they wanted. After telling him about all the evidence against his brother and detailing what he did with the 17-year-old girl, the man decided to tell them everything. He claimed that Naris actually was not at home that evening and only returned around 7:30 p.m. He was covered in dirt and immediately threw all his clothes into the washing machine. When the police started to question all the residents and reached their house, Naris whispered to his brother, "Tell them I was home at that time." Later, Naris explained that he was afraid he would be framed for a crime he didn't commit because he was an immigrant and had no alibi for the time of the abduction. The younger brother truly believed that his relative had nothing to do with it, but after hearing about all the evidence, he realized it wasn't the case. Lisa's funeral took place only a month after her murder. The church where it was held could only accommodate 130 people, but there were many more who came to say goodbye to her. Organizers even decided to set up benches and large screens outside so that everyone could watch the ceremony. The trial began 4 months after the murder. This case once again captured the attention of the entire country, so everyone involved in the process was under tremendous pressure. None of them had the right to make a mistake. Naris's lawyer insisted that his client's DNA could have ended up on the victim's clothing because he had worked in the barn. The prosecution, however, pointed out that this version made no sense, especially in the case of Lisa's underwear. The only way the suspect's DNA could have ended up there was if he touched the victim's underwear. The lawyer couldn't provide any other solid facts pointing to his client's innocence. At one point, he tried to push the version that the real murderer was Naris's younger brother. According to this theory, the brother somehow took multiple samples of Naris's DNA and placed them on the victim's body as well as at the crime scene. However, the lawyer failed to explain the possibility of such manipulations with the DNA. The trial lasted for a month, and Naris was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a high-security prison. Given that this is Sweden we're talking about, the facility resembled more of a decent 3-star hotel. His lawyer attempted to appeal the verdict. In early 2017, Naris himself applied for deportation and was transferred to a prison in his homeland, although Lithuanian prisons are significantly worse than Swedish ones. The reasons for this decision were unknown at the time. The court decided to approve his request, despite the fact that providing comfortable conditions of detention cost Swedish taxpayers several hundred per day for each individual inmate. Later that same year, his motives became clear when he appealed to a Lithuanian court, and his sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. However, the joy was short-lived for the murderer, as a few weeks later, the court overturned its decision, and Naris was once again destined to spend his entire life in prison. Only now he had no chance of returning to the comfortable Swedish cell. 5 years later, in August 2022, Naris faced yet another downside of being transferred to a Lithuanian prison. While inmates were being moved to another block, one of them attacked Naris with a shank. He suffered serious injuries and died on the way to the hospital. As for his wife, the question of her involvement is still not entirely ruled out. Police noted that there is practically no chance of her direct involvement in the abduction or murder, as experts would have found her DNA on Lisa's clothing or belongings. However, it cannot be ruled out that she knew of her husband's crime and helped him evade justice by providing a false alibi. Naris's younger brother also raises questions. Cafe employees reported seeing 2 men standing near the barn and watching them. Considering that one of them was likely Naris himself, the second should have been his brother. However, the man's DNA was not found either in the barn itself or on Lisa's clothing, making his involvement in the murder unlikely. Perhaps they were indeed observing the young employees with the older brother and even discussing inappropriate things, but only Naris decided to commit such a heinous crime. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Gabby Doolin. Gabby Doolin was born on December 26, 2007 in the small town of Scottsville, Kentucky, with a population of just over 4,000 people. Scottsville was mostly a farming community where many folks knew each other well, or at least knew someone from each local family. Like in many similar small towns, there weren't a lot of entertainment options in Scottsville. The only major thing for locals was school sports, particularly football. The local school had pretty decent fields for football, baseball, and tennis, where they regularly hosted games and competitions. It became a sort of tradition for locals to attend these activities, especially if their children were involved. Gabby's family was no different. Her parents had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. The oldest boy was on the school's football team, while Gabby herself got into cheerleading in November 2015 when she was 7. Their town was gearing up for the biggest football game of the year, and Gabby's older brother was on the team. However, Gabby was more interested in just hanging out and having fun with other kids than in the game itself. Her parents initially planned to leave Gabby at home with their youngest son under the care of a relative, but Gabby managed to convince them to take her with them. On the evening of November 14th, they headed to the school field. Besides the local crowd, there were also many folks from the other county who came to watch the game and support their team. As soon as their family arrived at the stadium, Gabby spotted her friends and asked her mom if she could go play with them. Her mom agreed, but warned her to stay within the school grounds and stick with the other kids. After that, her mom went to the bleachers and Gabby ran off to her friends. From then on, Gabby dashed back and forth to her mom a few times before going off to play again. At some point, she also came to her dad, who was in an announcement room, and Gabby asked him for some money to buy some snacks at the concession stand before darting away. Sometime later, Gabby's friends ran up to her mom in the bleachers. She glanced at the group and immediately noticed her daughter wasn't among them. The girls asked if she had seen Gabby, and they seemed visibly worried. The woman replied that she hadn't seen her for quite a while. She then asked what was going on, and the girls explained they had decided to play hide and seek. Gabby was supposed to find them, and they hid in the restroom, but time passed, and Gabby never found them. Thinking they had won, the girls left their hiding spot and went to look for her, but Gabby was nowhere to be found. They called her name, checked all the places they had been playing before, but their friend seemed to have vanished into thin air. That's when they thought Gabby might have gone to the bleachers to her mom and ran there. Her mother immediately started to panic and went to her husband, but Gabby wasn't there either. She told him that Gabby was missing, and he rushed to search the area around the stadium. Meanwhile, the mother went to the concession stand where her daughter had wanted to buy some snacks and began searching for her there. On the way, the parents met their friends and informed them about their daughter's disappearance. Hearing that, they joined the worried parents, helping with the search. After scouring the entire area around the stadium and finding no sign of Gabby, the parents went back and made an announcement over the loudspeakers, hoping Gabby would hear it, but that yielded no results either. By that time, there was a break in the game and people were returning to the bleachers. The parents continued asking everyone if they had seen Gabby, and some of them joined in the search as well. They went out again to search the area around the stadium and asked the staff to turn on flashlights around the baseball field, which led to a small forest. The adults walked through it, but still couldn't find her. By this time, about 20 minutes had passed since her disappearance, and the parents decided to call the police. Officers immediately arrived at the school, listened to the parents' and Gabby's friends' accounts, and began searching. The local police department had little experience with such serious cases, as child disappearances rarely occurred in their small town. The officers immediately considered the worst-case scenario that someone had abducted or attacked her. In that case, they faced one problem. The likely perpetrator was probably at the stadium watching the game, which was about to end any minute. So the officers realized they had very little time, and soon people would start going home, including the alleged perpetrator. Eventually, they decided to halt the game and lock down the stadium, keeping everyone inside the building. Officers watched every exit to prevent anyone from slipping away. The police didn't inform people about what was happening to avoid disrupting the search efforts. If everyone knew that the police were considering the possibility that a kidnapper of a 7-year-old girl was in the same vicinity as them, the situation could quickly escalate. Meanwhile, state police arrived at the school and began searching the area. They reached the baseball field and headed into the woods. After some distance into the trees, they stumbled upon a small creek and saw her body in it. They identified her as Gabby and called for an ambulance to take the body to the medical examiner. However, even a visual inspection was enough to suggest that the cause of death was asphyxiation, as there were distinct marks on her neck. Part of her clothing was also missing, leading the police to suspect that the victim had been sexually assaulted. Gabby's mother saw the ambulance near the woods and thought the police had found her daughter who needed medical attention. She rushed there, but the police stopped her as they didn't want the woman to see this horrifying scene. Now that the police were dealing with a murder, they decided to move everyone from the stadium to the school gym. Investigators believed that the killer was likely among them, so they needed to quickly figure out how to identify them. They spoke to Gabby's parents and told them about what likely happened to their daughter. Investigators also asked if they had any suspicions about who could have committed such a heinous act. Perhaps they had noticed someone suspicious, or someone had threatened their family. But Gabby's parents insisted they had no idea who could have done this. Detectives then talked to Gabby's friends and asked if they had seen anything strange that evening. Maybe someone had been watching or following them. But the girls said they couldn't recall anything like that. The police also brought them to the gym and asked them to look carefully at the people present, hoping they might remember something, but it didn't lead to anything. The lead detective continued to believe that the victim's friends might have seen the kidnapper, but either they were afraid to point him out or simply didn't understand the significance of their observations due to their age. He kept asking them to remember every moment of that evening, and finally, one of them mentioned that when they hid from Gabby in the restroom, she saw a man near the door. She remembered almost no details about his appearance except that he was wearing a denim jacket. The police spoke to the cashier who sold tickets to the game, and he also recalled the man with the denim jacket hanging on his arm. He added that this person seemed strange and intoxicated to him. However, they still couldn't identify this man. At that moment, the police gradually interviewed the attendees of the game, and pretty soon, everyone learned why they were being held there. Realizing that they might be in the same room with the killer, people were frightened, especially for their kids, but still cooperated with the police and answered their questions. Investigators cross-referenced the list of names of all the men in the gym with a sex offenders registry, but there were no matches. The police also sent officers to the homes of several such offenders living within close proximity, but they all had solid alibis, and none of them were near the school. Meanwhile, officers continued to interview people at the school, and they soon came across some interesting leads. Several individuals told them that during the game they saw a man named Timothy Madden near the women's restroom behaving strangely. He was a local resident, so many people knew him, but according to witnesses, that evening he was acting suspiciously. They also mentioned that he was wearing a denim jacket, the same description provided by one of Gabby's friends who had also seen a man near the restroom. Another witness was a distant relative of Timothy. He mentioned that during the game, Timothy seemed kind of off, and his younger son was playing on the field, but according to the witness, Timothy, who usually was very involved in his son's sports achievements, wasn't even paying attention to the field and seemed lost. Several more witnesses told the police that Timothy's behavior seemed strange to them, prompting investigators to talk to him. It was already nighttime, and they had to release almost everyone from the school. They decided to visit him, but first asked the local sheriff what he thought about Timothy. The sheriff said that he had known him practically all his life and highly doubted that he was capable of such a crime. Timothy had almost no criminal record except for some traffic fines, and he had never been involved in any suspicious situations before. Timothy lived with his wife and 5 children, and the police decided to go talk to him immediately. When they knocked on his door, Timothy opened it, and the officers asked if he knew why they were there. He replied that he had heard about her murder, but had nothing to do with it. Detectives then decided to try one trick and asked him a loaded question. They asked whether he had any explanation for several videos provided by eyewitnesses, showing him talking to Gabby shortly before her murder. There were no videos or witnesses, and the question was designed to prompt the man to reveal some new information if he indeed had something to do with the crime. At first, Timothy said he didn't know, but then he quickly corrected himself. He admitted that he did talk to Gabby that evening near the stadium. According to him, he stepped out to smoke, and at that moment, several girls ran past him. Shortly after, Gabby passed by and asked if he had seen her friends because they were playing hide and seek, and she needed to find them. Timothy pointed her in the right direction, and she ran off. The detectives found it suspicious how quickly Timothy changed his story. Moreover, his account indicated that he spoke to the victim just minutes before her disappearance, and at that time, there were no witnesses outside the stadium, so it gave him the opportunity to commit the crime. The detectives also asked if he would have any explanation if they found his DNA on the victim's body, and Timothy calmly replied no. Finally, they asked him to provide them with a DNA sample and the clothing he wore at the stadium. He agreed to both requests, but as soon as Timothy handed over the clothing to the police, they discovered some stains on it. There was something resembling blood stains on the pants, denim jacket, and even underwear. Detectives asked if he could explain it, and Timothy claimed that they were insane and that it wasn't blood, but some dirt. However, the police thought otherwise, although they needed to wait for the DNA analysis results before they could arrest him. Even though this case was a priority for the lab, it still took several days for the experts to examine all the samples and conduct the analysis. The forensic pathologist soon finished examining the body and confirmed that Gabby's cause of death was manual strangulation. He also confirmed that the victim had been brutally assaulted and extracted a biological sample of the perpetrator, which was sent to the laboratory the day after the murder. Something unexpected happened. The police received an anonymous letter from someone who reported a suspicious individual present at the game. The author wrote down the model of his car and even the license plate, which allowed the investigators to quickly identify the owner of the vehicle. It turned out to be a student living half an hour's drive from Scottsville. The police went there and began questioning him, but the guy claimed he hadn't been to any game and hadn't even heard of the murder. He added that he was at work that evening, and the police found undoubtful confirmation of his alibi. He was crossed off the list of suspects, but the author of the letter was never found. Perhaps someone decided to frame him or play a cruel prank, but the guy was truly innocent. The police soon received another lead. Several people reported strange behavior by a local 16-year-old boy. He told different people that he had been at the game, but then claimed he hadn't attended it. The young man also mentioned seeing girls playing hide and seek. Detectives found out that this boy was Timothy Madden's son, but that wasn't the most surprising revelation. They learned that just 2 weeks before the murder, the boy had become angry with his father and held a knife to his throat, threatening to kill him. Knowing this information, the police headed to speak with him. But there was a problem. They needed the presence of the minor's parents, and his mother refused to provide a DNA sample, leaving the police empty-handed. In Scottsville, a small town where everyone knew each other, rumors spread like wildfire. People heard that the police were looking into the Madden family regarding Gabby's murder, sparking various theories. Some thought one of Madden's troubled older sons could be responsible, while others suspected Madden himself or thought he might be covering for his sons. Gabby's parents also became aware of these rumors, which came as a big shock to them. Gabby's father had known Timothy since 3rd grade and also knew his whole family. Their sons played on the same football team, and their daughters were cheerleading together. Both families were close, even sitting near each other at the game. With all this in mind, Gabby's parents found it hard to believe that anyone from their circle could have been involved in the murder. After the rumors spread around town, something else happened. The eldest son of the Madden family, who was 20 years old, began contacting local officers on social media. He used foul language and threatened them, demanding they leave his family alone. He was immediately arrested for the threats, and the police quickly discovered that there was an active warrant for his arrest in another town. It turned out he was suspected of assaulting a minor girl. They brought him in for questioning, and the young man claimed he was simply frustrated by the accusations against his family. He also said he had nothing to do with the murder, and that he was at his cousin's house in the neighboring town that evening. He agreed to provide his DNA sample, which was also sent to the laboratory on November 20th. 6 days after the murder, Gabby's funeral took place. Hundreds of people came to say goodbye, not only from Scottsville, but also from other towns. people donated a significant amount of money to Gabby's parents to help cover the funeral and farewell ceremony expenses. Meanwhile, the lab completed the DNA analysis and compared the blood and semen samples with Timothy and his son's DNA. The results showed a complete match. The semen found on the victim's body belonged to Timothy Madden, and the blood on his clothes belonged to Gabby. Upon receiving this news, detectives went to the funeral when Gabby's parents were alone and informed them of the discovery of the killer. At the same time, the police officers went to Timothy's house and he was arrested. As he was being transported from the police station, he shouted to the gathered reporters that he was innocent. Later, he claimed that the blood on his clothes was his own, as he had scratched himself passing by a fence, even though initially he had told the police that it wasn't blood at all but mud. With the DNA match in hand, the investigators took the case to court and the prosecution stated they would seek the death penalty. During the trial preparation, Timothy's lawyer insisted his client was innocent and that the origin of the evidence raised serious questions. He argued that during the supposed murder, Timothy was at the stadium filming the game, even though Timothy himself had told the police he saw Gabby around the same time. The lawyer also tried to point out the fact that Gabby's body was found in a creek, but his client's clothes were dry when he returned to the stadium. Timothy's mother, who lived with him, stated that Timothy returned home in clean clothes, didn't look troubled, and behaved as usual. However, the prosecution pointed out that all these arguments crumbled in the face of the fact that the suspect's semen was found on the victim's body. There could be no other explanation for this, and therefore, there was no doubt about Timothy's involvement. According to the police, his account of that evening contains some portion of the truth. He could have indeed stepped out of the stadium during the game and encountered Gabby, who was looking for her friends. She knew Timothy well because he was the father of one of her friends. She might have approached him and asked where the other girls had gone, and that's when he devised a plan. He could have said they ran into the woods behind the baseball field and offered to escort Gabby there. Once they were a few hundred yards away from the school, he could have assaulted and killed her, then returned to the game. The wait for the trial dragged on for years, much to Gabby's family's dismay. They wanted the murderer to be punished, but due to bureaucracy, the case progressed slowly. In 2019, 4 years after the murder, the parties began discussing a possible plea deal. The prosecution offered to drop the death penalty in exchange for a life sentence, with Timothy having to admit his guilt. Gabby's parents agreed to this option because the endless wait for the trial was a heavy burden for them. Moreover, if the trial finally began, they would have to attend hearings for months, essentially reliving their daughter's death all over again. Timothy, who kept insisting on his innocence, eventually agreed and confessed. However, the terms of the deal didn't require him to reveal the details of what he did. He just had to admit his guilt. These terms didn't satisfy Gabby's family because they wanted the perpetrator to fully confess to what he had done to their daughter. During the court hearing, Gabby's father started yelling at Timothy, while the defendant's relatives began shouting at Gabby's family. Eventually, the judge had to take a break and separate them. In the end, Timothy received a life sentence and went to serve it in a maximum security prison. But that's not all. In 2016, a year after Gabby's murder, something else happened involving Timothy Madden. A boy from a neighboring state saw a news report about the crime and recognized Timothy. Several years ago, he and his friend were walking near a mall parking lot when an adult man approached them. He tried to convince the boys to get into his car for a ride, but they found the offer extremely strange and ran away from him. The friend's relative contacted the police, and according to the boy who saw the news report, he was no other than Timothy Madden. However, there was no substantial evidence for this case, so it didn't progress any further. Nevertheless, if Timothy had indeed attempted to abduct 2 boys in another state, it could tell us about his true nature more clearly. Perhaps before Gabby's murder, he had been trying to find other victims but had no success. And on that evening when she approached him near the stadium, he decided to seize the opportunity to satisfy his horrific fantasies. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Alison Baden Clay. Alison Baden was born on July 1, 1968 in a Brisbane suburb. Raised in an affluent family, she developed a passion for ballet early on. After school, she pursued higher education, excelling academically and mastering 6 languages. At 25 in 1993, Alison won a local beauty pageant, showcasing her ballet skills. Following university, she secured a position in the HR department at Brisbane's Flight Centre, where her career quickly advanced, recognized by her boss as a bright and promising talent. It was here that Alison met Gerard, who would later become her husband. Gerard Baden Clay was born on September 9, 1970, in Bournemouth, UK. He came from a notable lineage, with his great-grandfather, Robert Baden Powell, being a famed British military leader and founder of the Scouting movement. Gerard was just a year old when his family moved to Zambia, his father Nigel Clay's homeland. After 8 years in Zambia, they immigrated to Australia. Gerard completed his education in Australia and pursued a degree in accounting. He eventually joined the Flight Centre for work, where he met Alison's. It was at the Flight Centre where Gerard encountered Alison, leading to a blossoming relationship. Gerard and Alison Baden Clay exchanged vows on August 23, 1997. Following their nuptials, they embarked on a global tour, including stops in South America, Switzerland, and a stint in London. Once back in Australia, Alison resumed her career at the Flight Centre, eventually rising to a management position. In 2002, she became pregnant and later gave birth to their first child, Hannah. After Hannah's birth, Alison chose to dedicate herself entirely to family life. During this period, Gerard explored various occupations and established a premium real estate agency in Brisbane in 2004, with his parents' involvement in the business. Known for his lively and self-assured demeanor, Gerard dedicated substantial time and effort to his work. The family grew with the birth of their second daughter, Sarah, in 2004, and their youngest, Ella, in 2006. They lived in a verdant home situated in the suburban area of Brookfield, Brisbane. Alison, primarily a homemaker, was deeply engaged in caring for her daughters. Over time, Alison noticed that Gerard was becoming increasingly distant and aloof. This reached a climax when he made the shocking admission that he no longer loved her. Gerard's behavior towards Alison changed, with him frequently criticizing her. He would berate her for making unappealing meals or for not keeping their home clean, sometimes labeling Alison as lazy and expressing that she no longer appealed to him romantically. In the face of these remarks, Alison chose to remain quiet, enduring the harshness of his words. She maintained a personal diary where she documented her enduring love for Gerard, the recurring disputes at home, her own feelings of guilt, and her determination to correct her perceived faults in hopes of rekindling his affection. Despite the turmoil within her family life, Alison managed to mask her inner struggles with an outward appearance of cheerfulness. She was consistently seen as a warm, benevolent individual, a devoted mother, and a loving spouse. In 2011, after the devastating floods in Queensland, Gerard's business faced financial difficulties, accumulating debts of approximately $1 million Australian dollars. That October, Alison discovered that Gerard was engaged in a secret affair with Tony McHugh, a colleague at his agency. Gerard and Tony had first crossed paths in 2008 when she was a client, and later, he hired her. At that time, Tony, a 17-year marriage veteran with children, was experiencing marital troubles. The affair with Gerard quickly escalated, culminating in her divorce. Tony was aware of Gerard's marital status. He had portrayed his relationship with Alison as platonic, claiming their marriage lacked intimacy and that he remained with Alison solely for their daughters. Gerard assured Tony of a future together, including marriage. However, after nearly 4 years, Gerard had still not initiated divorce proceedings when Alison discovered the affair in October 2011. Gerard informed Tony that they had to end their relationship. He terminated the affair, dismissed Tony from his real estate business, and reconciled with his wife without Tony, who held on to the hope of a future together. 4 months later, Tony and Gerard were conversing over the phone while she drove home. They talked about an upcoming real estate conference scheduled for the next day. Unexpectedly, Gerard mentioned that Tony would encounter Allison there. Upset by this foreseen development, Tony questioned Gerard's delay in telling her and accused him of habitual dishonesty in response to her frustration and doubts about their future. Gerard apologized, reaffirmed his love, and reiterated his commitment to divorcing within 3 months. He emphasized his intention to leave Allison, mentioning her mental health struggles. The following morning, on April 20th at 7:14 a.m., a distressed Gerard contacted the police, reporting Allison's disappearance after a walk around 10 p.m. the previous night. Upon arrival at the Bowden Clay home, police observed deep curved scratches on Gerard's face, which he attributed to a shaving accident. During a further examination for photographs, police noticed small red marks on his chest, which Gerard explained as bites from a caterpillar encountered while changing an outdoor light. The house inspection revealed no overt signs of disturbance. It was orderly with the bed neatly made. Gerard was composed, getting his daughters ready for school and daycare. Police interviewed Hannah, Sarah, and Ella, who recalled falling asleep to their mother's lullabies and hadn't seen her since she turned off the light. The girls, tearful during questioning, described their parents as generally happy and good to each other. The police initiated a search in the vicinity and interviewed neighbors for any leads on Allison's whereabouts, but no one reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary. The only clues discovered that day were a small blood stain in Allison's car and a strand of her hair in the trunk. A larger-scale search operation was soon underway, with rescue teams and volunteers scouring the nearby woods, wells, shafts, and dams close to the Bowden Clay residence. A mannequin was placed, dressed similarly to Allison's last known attire, to aid in the search efforts. As time progressed, the likelihood of finding Allison alive diminished. Her friends clung to hope, unwilling to consider the worst. Gerard, visibly distraught, tearfully spoke to the media, yearning for his wife's return. Concurrently, he advised his mistress, Tony, to halt their communication and keep a low profile, promising that they would eventually be together. A decade after Allison vanished, on April 30th, 2012, a boater found a decomposed body by the Colo Creek riverbank, around 8 miles from the Bowden Clay home. The next day, Gerard reached out to the insurance company to discuss claiming his wife's life insurance, valued at $800,000 Australian dollars. Shortly after, the body discovered under the bridge was confirmed as the 43-year-old Allison Bowden Clay by a medical examiner. The advanced decomposition made determining the exact cause of death challenging. Dental records confirmed Allison's identity, and she was dressed in the same outfit as when she disappeared. Forensic indications pointed to possible strangulation, leading to the classification of her death as a homicide. On May 11, 2012, St. Paul's Church hosted Allison Bowden Clay's funeral. Gerard, visibly distraught, shed tears throughout the service, consoling his daughters and extending solace to Allison's parents. The ceremony saw a large turnout, with hundreds in attendance. Concurrently, Gerard maintained discreet contact with his mistress, Tony, using public phones for communication. He apprised her of the tragic circumstances surrounding his wife's death and implored Tony to keep their clandestine relationship hidden from police inquiries. Gerard maintained his claim that Allison had gone for a walk around 10 p.m. and was gone by the time he woke up. However, contradictory evidence emerged. Detectives found that Gerard had charged his phone at 2 a.m. and was on his computer at 5 a.m., searching for information about the right to remain silent. Forensic analysis contradicted his claim of shaving cuts, suggesting the marks on his cheek resembled fingernail scratches. Additionally, no blood was detected on his razor. A biologist challenged Gerard's explanation of caterpillar bites on his chest, noting the absence of such caterpillars in the family's area that could have caused such marks. A botanical specialist concluded that the marks were not consistent with caterpillar bites. When Allison's body was discovered, Her hair contained 5 distinct leaf types: eucalyptus, Chinese elm, crepe myrtle, cat's claw vine, and fishbone fern. Notably, 2 of these varieties, eucalyptus and Chinese elm, grew directly under the bridge where her body was found. Significantly, all 5 types of leaves and thorns were present in the backyard of the Bowden Clay family residence a month after Alison's funeral on June 13, 2012. 41-year-old Gerard Baden Clay was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. Asserting his innocence, he vowed to fight the charges and sought bail, which was promptly denied due to concerns he might flee during questioning. Investigators contacted Tony, who disclosed the truth about their 4-year clandestine relationship. Notably, just days before Alison's disappearance, Gerard had sent Tony a letter promising that he would be with her by July 1st. The prosecution alleged that Gerard Baden Clay murdered Alison to claim an insurance payout, clear his debts, and start anew with Tony McHugh. They theorized that on the night of April 19, 2012, after putting their daughters to bed, Alison joined Gerard to watch TV. An intense argument is believed to have erupted, during which Alison scratched Gerard's cheek. DNA traces were found under Alison's nails, but their origin was undetermined due to degradation. The prosecution suggested that Gerard strangled Alison, dragged her body through the backyard, entangling her hair with leaves, then transported her in her car's trunk to the river, disposing of her body under a bridge. They believed Gerard expected the river to wash the body away, concealing his crime. He reportedly returned home, charged his phone, cleaned the house, and reported Alison missing the next morning. After the discovery of the body, he sought legal counsel for criminal defense and visited the lawyer's office. At the June 2014 murder trial of Alison Baden Clay, the prosecution adamantly argued for Gerard's guilt. Gerard, however, steadfastly denied any involvement. In court, he admitted to a dispute with Alison, suggesting she might have left home late at night and, in her depressive state, possibly chosen to end her life. This theory was staunchly rejected by Alison's family and friends, who were convinced of her unwavering commitment to her daughters, believing she would never abandon them. Her friends voiced long-standing disapproval of Gerard, describing him as arrogant, disingenuous, and conceited, and believed Alison's deep love for him blinded her to these negative traits. At the trial, excerpts from Alison Baden Clay's diary were presented, revealing her sense of isolation and control by Gerard, especially after their first child's birth. She felt lonely, confined to the home, and detailed Gerard's controlling behavior, including insulting her, tracking her conversations through a baby monitor, managing her finances, erasing relatives' contacts from her phone, and blocking their calls. Following Alison's demise, Gerard's attempt to claim the insurance payout was rejected, with the funds being withheld pending the trial's conclusion. Another key testimony came from Melissa Romano, who had never met Gerard in person, but spoke with him on the phone in 2009 regarding a real estate deal. She testified that after finalizing the deal, Gerard made a startling call to her, proposing, "I'm looking for someone to kill my wife." Romano, taken aback, questioned his motive, but Gerard abruptly shifted the conversation and ended the call, leaving the statement unresolved. Gerard Baden Clay was convicted on July 15, 2014, and sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole after 15 years. In 2015, he challenged his sentence, leading to a court ruling that the murder was unintentional and thus reducing his prison term. This verdict, however, triggered a massive public outcry, culminating in protests with about 4,000 participants, standing in solidarity with Alison's family. Responding to the public sentiment, in 2016, the High Court of Australia overturned the appellate court's decision, reinstating the original murder conviction. Consequently, Gerard Baden Clay's parole eligibility has been deferred until at least 2027, while incarcerated. Initially, Gerard conducted himself as an exemplary inmate, but as time progressed, he adapted to prison life and became less restrained in his behavior, leading to an incident where he inappropriately touched a prison guard, resulting in a stern reprimand during his imprisonment. Gerard Baden-Clay also established a friendship with a 73-year-old businessman and millionaire, John Chardin, who was imprisoned for the manslaughter of his wife. Additionally, he developed a rapport with Mayan Carews, a convict serving time for the triple homicide of his girlfriend and her two siblings. Following the trial of Gerard Baden-Clay, his former mistress, Toni McHugh, moved to Bali, where she engaged in teaching and charity work. 4 years later, she relocated to the United Arab Emirates to continue her career in education. McHugh now leads a modest lifestyle and keeps her personal details under wraps. She occasionally connects with friends via social media using an anonymous account, cautious of Baden-Clay potentially locating her post-release. In her most recent media interaction, McHugh expressed remorse about the situation and clarified that she never intended harm to Allison. She also disclosed that Baden-Clay and Clay had been unfaithful to Allison with not only her but other women as well, including Hannah, Sarah, and Ella, the daughters of Gerard and Allison Baden-Clay. The children, Hannah, Sarah, and Ella, are being cared for by their maternal grandparents, Allison's parents. The entirety of Allison's estate, including any insurance money, was entrusted to her children in 2022. The eldest daughter, Hannah Baden-Clay, has completed her university education and has pursued a career in dancing, following in her mother's footsteps to honor Allison's memory. To address the critical issue of domestic violence, Allison's sister, Vanessa, founded a charitable organization dedicated to combating domestic abuse, raising awareness, and providing support to those impacted by such situations. Through this case, being able to recognize the signs of domestic and family violence is a crucial first step towards prevention. In Allison's case, there were numerous indicators, some more conspicuous than others. These signs included, but were not limited to, a sense of isolation from friends, family, and support systems, a significant degree of control over financial resources, and a gradual erosion of self-confidence and self-worth. Identifying these things early on is essential in order to address the underlying issues and provide the necessary support and resources to those affected by domestic and family violence. By being vigilant and attuned to the subtle and overt manifestations of this complex issue, we can take proactive measures to foster safer and more supportive environments for individuals and families. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Cassandra Cantrell. Fear is a negative and unpleasant feeling. Would anyone want to experience it over and over again? Cassandra Cantrell and her twin brother Rob were the exception. As young children, they couldn't go a day without the scary stories they liked to tell each other in a room with the lights off. Rob was a natural storyteller, or at least he thought he was. Cassandra would scream at every story he told, and he, playing the brave though small man, would sprawl on his bed. They also watched the animated series Scooby-Doo together, and while watching it, they argued over which of the characters in the story would turn out to be a ghost or a vampire in disguise. Cassandra's intuitive guesses were often ahead of her brother, and then he was nervous. Their mother, Mary Smith, although she did not share the same passion as the twins, bought them books by Robert Wall to instill a love of reading in her children. A love for scary stories was not just a childhood hobby, but a lifelong passion that the brother and sister shared. They even collected figurines of villains, and as adults, seriously considered opening a themed store associated with this culture of horror. An interest in horror movies brought Cassandra to the set in 2004, where she got a cameo in a scary movie that, although it didn't become popular, still caused a storm of envy in Rob, and he started asking his sister to make a deal for him. Rob was very happy, but to play, albeit in an episodic role, he was not able to. The head of the cast in that movie was Colin Dudley, and on the set, between him and debuting actress Cassandra, flashed a spark. To make the first step, each of them did not dare, but that all changed during a corporate Halloween party. Cassandra dressed up as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and Colin dressed up as Alex from A Clockwork Orange. For Cassandra, the image of the cartoon character was just an image, but for Colin Dudley, it seemed to be something more. He walked around with a glass of milk all evening, looking at everyone with a glare just as his character did in the movie, and he also talked a lot of quotes from the book. For example, looking at Cassandra with delight, he said, "Beauty invariably caused my only desire to destroy it, for it did not fit at all into our ugly world." Cassandra thought it was a compliment, and they soon began dating, but their relationship didn't last long. Only a couple of months later, Colin found another actress, Rebecca, and started dating her, and later the couple started living together. On August 25, 2020, Cassandra Cantrell disappeared. She, without warning anyone, drove her car away from home in an unknown direction and did not answer phone calls. The police officers were very reluctant to take a report from her mother for a very long time, trying to calm the poor woman down and saying that sometimes children grow up and don't always warn their parents when they go out with friends. But Mary Smith was sure that something terrible had happened. And maybe if the lazy cops would finally start working, she would still have a chance to see her daughter alive. The search for Cassandra did not begin until 2 days later, and on the third day, the police found her car under a bridge, not in the most favorable area. Also, to add to the bad news, the car was unlocked and the keys were inside. It was impossible to understand what Cassandra was doing here. This place was considered a neighborhood of homeless people, where, with frequent frequency, the police found their bodies killed in a domestic fight or died of an overdose of illegal drugs. The officers had to go around the neighborhood questioning a lot of homeless people who, at the sight of the police, tried to get away for a while. But it was all to no avail. None of them had seen Cassandra, and none of them knew when the car showed up there. It was hard to expect anything else from the residents who lived under the bridge and drank alcohol all day long. The detective involved in the search for Cassandra had requested her cell phone billing, as he was instructed to do, but from experience, he was sure it would get him nowhere, and so it did. The signal showed that the phone was in the nearest body of water to the bridge, which meant that the detectives would not be able to recover it and get the information they needed. Nevertheless, a team of divers began searching the coastal area, and before they did so, standing on the shore, they picked up rocks from the ground and threw them into the water, testing how far they could throw the phone. Cassandra's mother said that her missing daughter's phone case was decorated with rhinestones, which meant it would not be difficult to find. Indeed, the phone was soon found, but Cassandra's body was not in the water. This things was presented to her mother as good news, but the poor woman did not feel any better. She seemed to have gotten used to the idea that her daughter was dead, and the only thing she wanted was for her body to be found and for this nightmare of uncertainty to end. Cassandra, as it seemed to her mother, despite her already realized age, was not married and did not even meet anyone. It was understandable that she had gotten pregnant by a man, but Mary had no information about the father of the child. Although, again from the words of her mother, her daughter very often corresponded with someone and called, but the phone number of her interlocutor, for some reason, was not recorded in the daughter's book, and the mother, of course, did not remember the numbers. She just noticed that it is quite strange to communicate so often with a person and not write down his number. Cassandra could not keep their relationships in absolute secrecy, and there should be at least one friend with whom Cassandra shared her secrets, and especially if those secrets were related to pregnancy. Such a friend was found, and in a conversation with police officers, she revealed that Cassandra had rekindled her relationship with her former boyfriend, Colin Dudley. Yes, their past relationship in 2004 was short-lived, and besides, it's been 15 years since their breakup. It is strange in general that after so much time, they remembered each other. As it turned out, Colin himself came out to Cassandra, with whom he once worked on a movie set in 2014. He found Cassandra on Facebook, wrote some warm words, and confessed that just recently his father died, with whom his wife, Rebecca, had a difficult relationship, and so he had no one to share his grief with. Cassandra, purely because of friendly motives, decided to meet and talk to the ex-boyfriend to calm him down. But the friendly meeting turned into something more. Since 2014, Colin began to live literally on two families, where Cassandra was in the status of mistress. When the young woman found out that she was pregnant, she did not want to inform Colin Dudley because every time she wanted to admit it to him, she recalled their conversation, where Colin said that he absolutely did not want children and that he was very happy about Rebecca being infertile. The news that he might have a daughter or son could destroy a real family, and Cassandra didn't want to hurt her lover, so she kept the news a secret. Meanwhile, her belly was growing, and it was impossible to hide it under the oversized sweaters, and in order for Colin not to guess anything, Cassandra stopped seeing him. But she couldn't hide it for long, and if she lied about having another boyfriend, it would hurt Colin and cause them to break up. Cassandra decided that the bitter truth was better than a sweet lie, so she told Colin over the phone that she was expecting a child with him. Colin was silent for a while, and then he finally said that he was delighted to hear the news. It sounded very strange, but Cassandra concluded that Colin was genuinely pleased. The detective arrived at Colin's house, knocked on the door, and his wife opened it. Deciding that it wasn't quite ethical to talk about a missing mistress in the presence of Colin's legal wife, the detective introduced himself as an old friend of Dudley's. Colin came out immediately, shut the door behind him, and walked away from the house with the detective, though the latter hadn't even introduced himself yet. It was as if he had been waiting for this meeting. "Thank you for not making your credentials public in front of Rebecca. You're a man of honor, a true officer. My compliments to you," Colin spoke in short sentences. "I heard Cassandra is missing. It's weird, bloody weird. I can't even guess where. She might have gone. She told me she'd had a big fight with her brother and was really worried about it. I advised her to stop by and make up with him. I don't know if she listened to me or not." That Cassandra and Rob had been in a fight, the detective knew. Rob had told him about it himself. It was nothing serious, just a family misunderstanding. But nevertheless, Cassandra's twin brother had been very upset about it because the day she disappeared, Cassandra had called him and wanted to come and talk to him. But his proud brother had refused, and now he blamed himself for it. If his sister had come to see him that day, she wouldn't have disappeared. "You know, officer, I'm not the nicest person. I think you realize that. Dating my ex-girlfriend in secret from my wife and for such a long period of time. I'm sure I'll be punished for it in the next world, but the human heart doesn't decide who you fall in love with. In 2014, my father died. He literally hated Rebecca with all his soul, and the feeling was mutual, but he really liked Cassandra. He often remembered her, reproached me for the fact that we broke up with her almost immediately after Christmas. We often fight with our parents, accusing them of not understanding, and then it turns out that it's us, their children, who don't understand, and it hurts. My father was right, of course, and after he died I just wanted to fulfill one of his wishes, and so I resumed my relationship with Cassandra. Rebecca needed to be broken up with. It was a conversation I kept putting off, you know. This family stuff sucks you dry, so I kept stalling. I've been living a double life for 5 years. It was hell. I had to make excuses for coming home late all the time to hide it. I'd tell her about some fictitious business trips and even bought a fishing rod, even though I hated fishing, a stupid pastime. And I'd tell Rebecca I was going to the lake while I went to Cassandra's before coming home. I'd buy fish at the supermarket for extra convincing, and Rebecca would bake it in the oven, and I'd eat it, even though the smell of fish makes me sick. The detective said, "Did you know Cassandra was pregnant?" Dudley replied in surprise, "Pregnant by whom?" The detective then explained, "I don't have that information, but she told a close friend of hers that it was from you." Dudley affirmed that can't be true. She's been adamantly refusing to see him lately, and he understand her and can't blame her for that. Naturally, she was tired of being in the background and wanted a family, which unfortunately he couldn't give her. He guessed that the reason she refused to see him was because she had found someone else. The detective asked Colin when he last saw Cassandra. Colin claimed that the last time he saw her was about 3 or 4 months ago. This was not Colin's last encounter with the detective. Even though Cassandra's phone, which was lifted from the bottom of the pond and could not be recovered, the police requested the details of the calls of the missing person, and it turned out that most likely the unsigned number about which her mother told her belongs to Colin Dudley. Most often, Cassandra called him, and even on the day of her disappearance, they called each other. In addition, on that day, the police received CCTV footage from the train station near the bridge where Cassandra's abandoned car had been found, and on it they saw a strange man who stood out in the crowd of passengers on the platform. He wore a long cloak, gloves, his face was hidden in a scarf, and a hat was placed on his head, the sides of which covered his eyes. It was impossible to make out the face, but the detective said that the man's gait reminded him very much of Colin Dudley. As for the hat, it was almost identical to the one worn by Alex from A Clockwork Orange. After continuing to follow the strange man through the CCTV cameras, the detectives noticed that he literally went into the cafe for a few minutes, then came out of there and went towards the parking lot where he got into his car and drove away. During all this time, the stranger never showed his face, but they could see the license plate number of the car in which the stranger got into, and the car belonged to Colin Dudley. A unit was sent to his house with a search warrant. The detectives had initially believed that Cassandra was alive and in the basement of Dudley's house. At first, there was no evidence of a murder at Colin's house. However, in the closet, they found the very hat that Colin was trying to cover himself with. They then went down to the basement, but Cassandra was not there, nor was there any evidence of the crime. However, the service dog, trained to search by the scent of blood, barked as it sniffed the couch, which was already a very alarming sign. Colin assured the police that he had done nothing illegal and that they simply had no evidence and no other suspects, so they were trying to pin the crime on him, an innocent man. The detective interviewed his wife, who was shocked at what was going on in their home, the accusations against her husband, and the fact that she had been deceived for years. When the detective asked her if her husband was capable of murder, she answered in the negative after thinking about it for a long time. The evidence found against Colin was not enough to put him in jail, which made Rob and Mary Smith very angry. The detective was just throwing up his hands. Colin was called in for questioning again, and he thought carefully about the crime, as he had an alibi for all the allegations on the morning of August 25th at 6:30 a.m. Colin visited a hardware store where he purchased household cleaning chemicals and trash bags, and the store's cameras confirmed this. However, the large trash bags overshadowed this situation. Colin then received a text message from Cassandra that she was almost at his house. In order to accurately track the route, seized a GPS tracker from Colin's car. The device completely replicated the movement of Cassandra's cell phone signal, but there was new evidence in the case based on his movements. The next day, the cops retraced his path that went through the woods, and there, in a ravine, they spotted a huge trash can tied with ropes. All the ground around it was covered in blood, and it became clear what was in the container. By then, it had been a month since the murder, and identifying the body was difficult. The police were helped by Cassandra's tattoo, which was described in the search notes. Colin was apprehended the same day and charged with murder. Forensics conducted a forensic examination and indicated that death was caused by a fractured skull due to blunt force trauma. During the examination of the basement of the Dudley house, the police found traces of blood that could not be completely cleaned. Rebecca knew nothing about the murder, as she spent all day in another part of the house, from which no noise in the basement could be heard. She also confirmed that Colin never wanted children, and his story about her infertility was just a fiction, which the police took as a motive for the crime. During the trial, due to the lack of witnesses and physical evidence, such as the murder weapon, it was impossible to convince the jury that the murder was committed by Colin Dudley. Then the court made a deal with the killer that if he pleaded guilty, he would get a lesser sentence. Colin was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Cassandra's mother and her brother, who still felt guilty that he had not agreed to meet with his sister before her death, were very upset because the killer would most likely live to see the moment when he could go free. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Sierra Lamar. The story begins in Fremont, California. Sierra Lamar's family, consisting of her father Steve, a computer expert, her mother Marlene, and her older sister Danielle, lived in Fremont. Sierra was born on October 19, 1996, while Danielle was around 4 years her senior. The family experienced some common ups and downs. It was later discovered that when Danielle and Sierra were younger, their father Steve had engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior with one of their school classmates during a sleepover. This led to his 1-year imprisonment. Despite Steve's prior convictions, Sierra and Danielle said they got along well with him and that he had always been a kind and respected father. However, after the incident, Steve and Marlene decided to end their relationship. Marlene eventually decided to relocate from Fremont to Morgan Hill, a city located approximately 40 miles southwest of Fremont. She made this move together with Sierra and her boyfriend, Rick Gardner. Sierra was initially disappointed to be leaving her close friends and hobbies behind, but she eventually settled in at her new school, made new friends, and even rejoined the cheerleading squad. On March 11, 2012, Sierra called her parents in Fremont to update them on her progress. The discussion was mostly joyful, as she was enthusiastic about one of her upcoming school tasks and mentioned wanting to get her hair colored. The next time she went to Fremont, she told her sister all about her homework. She was obviously doing quite well in her academics. Sierra ended the chat with Danielle and Steve shortly after dinner because it was a Thursday, she had school the next day, and it was getting late. They all agreed to part ways for the evening and promised to speak again soon. However, none of them realized that this would be Danielle and Steve's final conversation with Sierra. February 16, 2012, it was an ordinary workday back in Morgan Hill. The Gardner-Lamar family got ready for the day as usual around 6 in the morning. Rick awoke to head out to work shortly after, and Marlene arrived to kiss Sierra on the forehead before heading out to work as well. Sierra had to get ready for school and lock the house. At this point, at 6:29 a.m., she texted a friend before putting on her shoes and walking out the front door to catch the bus. Pedo Hispanic Court was situated far from Sierra's high school and the rest of Morgan Hill. Sierra had to cross a deserted road between Palm and Dory Avenues every morning to catch the bus, just like many other children across America. While on her way at 7:11 a.m., she texted a friend to see if they could meet up before classes started. But when her school bus arrived at 7:15 a.m., just 4 minutes later, Sierra was not present. Sierra may have skipped class or even the entire school day because she didn't meet up with her friend. Her friends found it unusual that she didn't show up, but they didn't think it was wise to inform the school without her. The day proceeded as normal. Marlene routinely contacted Sierra after school to check on her, but found it unusual that her phone went straight to voicemail. However, she did not become worried. But when Marlene arrived home and saw that her daughter's room was still unoccupied, she realized that something was amiss. She contacted Steve to check if Sierra was planning to visit him in Fremont again. Unfortunately, this was not the case. When Sierra called Danielle and a few of her friends, they all left the same message. Marlene started to panic when she called Sierra's high school and found out that Sierra had missed all her classes. After calling the authorities, officers were sent immediately to Pedo Hispanic Court. However, since Sierra could have disappeared at any time, there was no clear starting point for the investigators. Those closest to Sierra, including several of her friends, were questioned first, and they were all very honest about the predicament that Sierra and her family were facing. Even though she was usually content, it had only been a few months since her mother's divorce had compelled her to leave her family and all of her old friends behind. Authorities believed that because she frequently made lighthearted and even serious comments about returning to Fremont, she had most likely left voluntarily. Despite the fact that the police downplayed Sierra's disappearance, other factors were moving in the exact opposite direction. She not only said nothing, but she also stopped posting anything to her social media accounts. She never arrived at the front door, her phone was off, and all calls went to voicemail. Naturally, Sierra's loved ones and friends were terrified, thus the massive search for Sierra Lamar got underway. Despite the police's ineffective attempts, the trail of evidence related to Sierra's disappearance is currently one of the longest, most intricate, and most fascinating cases I've ever covered. The investigation began on Sunday morning, 2 days after she vanished. Data forensics were examining the previous data from her phone when they discovered that it had sent a signal without any electrical activity in the middle of the night. The phone appeared to have been turned on briefly before being turned off again, and the coordinates on the phone led them to a field near Sierra's house. At dawn, a search team carefully combed through the fields where the phone had been detected, and after just a few minutes, they found it. The Samsung Galaxy that Sierra had been using was located near the road, and it had sustained significant physical damage. It was assumed that her phone had likely been thrown off the road. Investigators concluded that she had not turned on her phone that evening. Instead, they reasoned that the rain had caused a false signal, briefly activating her phone. What a fortunate coincidence. This was the conclusion of the story, which heavily relied on the authorities finding the woman's phone. The events that occurred were caused by a raindrop and a short circuit. Given the nature and circumstances of the case, the detectives found the possibility of the woman's phone being thrown from a moving vehicle to be particularly concerning, considering the lack of footprints, tire tracks, or any other visual evidence. The next day brought about yet another horrifying discovery. 2 kilometers from Sierra's house, a search crew found her backpack thrown just outside a barn. She had expected to go to school and was probably pushed away from her own essential items, as the bag included her schoolwork, inhaler, and money. Sadly, things only get worse from here. Additionally, a complete outfit, possibly the one she was wearing the morning she vanished, was found in her luggage. This ensemble included her pullover, pants, socks, shoes, and even undergarments. Her outfit was subjected to DNA testing, and the results were revealed. Her pants contained male foreign DNA, which suggested that she had likely been assaulted. Although the search had already intensified significantly in the days following Sierra's disappearance, the discovery of her phone and clothing sparked a fresh outpouring of local and international sympathy. Authorities received more than 1,000 fresh tips, and officers worked more than 7,000 hours. Several search teams were composed of more than 800 people. They examined every available lake and reservoir in the area, methodically combed over fields, and looked inside abandoned buildings. Sierra's name was a hot topic in the community, and posters for missing people were put up all over the place. Additionally, Sierra's parents offered a $10,000 reward to anyone with credible proof. However, despite their best efforts and those of the community, only a golf ball and a flipper were discovered. Investigators were closing in on a culprit, though the public was unaware. 12 days after Sierra's disappearance, DNA on her pants matched a local man. All 57 registered sex offenders in the area were investigated, and Sierra's father was quickly eliminated as a suspect. Anlin Garcia Torres, a 21-year-old man with a troubled past, emerged as a suspect after a successful DNA match. The suspicious relationship between Sierra and Anlin caused detectives to place him under constant watch. Nobody knew if Sierra was still alive or not, but Anlin was the most likely to know at this specific moment. The officers thus took a number of steps to keep an eye on his whereabouts and means of communication. His phone was tapped, a GPS tracker was covertly placed in his car, and 2 undercover police investigators shifted into an RV next to his house. After finding that the RV park had cameras at the front door, investigators also started looking through security footage from the neighborhood around Annalyn. They examined this film on the day of her disappearance to determine whether Annalyn had left or arrived home. At 7 a.m. on the morning Sierra vanished, Annalyn's travel time of 7 miles from his home to Sierra's was a perfect match for the period during which Sierra could have been kidnapped, even though Annalyn had departed for work at his normal time. Safeway's shift records showed that Annalyn did not show up for work on March 16th. When his management inquired further, they discovered additional unfavorable information about Annalyn. It turns out that just 3 years prior, 3 unsuccessful kidnapping attempts had occurred in this Safeway's parking lot. Thankfully, none of the perpetrators were ever formally recognized or detained. The only piece of evidence from each of these attempted kidnappings was a taser that the perpetrator had dropped. One of its batteries had a fingerprint on it. However, it was only a partial fingerprint, and only a direct one-to-one comparison could match it. The theory of Annalyn being the suspect seemed plausible, but when Annalyn's fingerprints were compared to those on the taser, a startling realization emerged. In reality, Annalyn was the suspect. The suspect was now in the hands of the investigators. He was positively identified as being present when Sierra vanished. His DNA was discovered on her pants, and he has a history of involvement in kidnappings. This was sufficient to detain him, question him, and seize his automobile for DNA testing. In spite of Annalyn's arrogance during the interview, the test results were unfavorable for him. He stated that the day Sierra vanished, he went fishing, that he had no idea who Sierra was, and that he was certain they would not discover anything. However, Annalyn did not end his interview before making a very peculiar revelation. Annalyn admitted to having the somewhat vile habit of masturbating while driving and disposing of the used tissue out the window. Additionally, he asserted that he had tossed out a used tissue in the precise spot where Sierra's bag was discovered on the morning she vanished. The cops didn't believe his absurd explanation. Annalyn Garcia Torres was formally detained on May 21, 2012, in connection with the disappearance of Sierra Lamar outside of his place of employment in a Safeway parking lot. This resulted from a number of distinct linkages between Sierra and Annalyn's vehicle. Her DNA was found on the interior door handle of the car's rear door, according to a DNA examination. Additionally, fibers from Annalyn's car seats matched those found on Sierra's clothing, and a piece of rope discovered inside his car included a hair strand from Sierra. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had been in his car at some point. But even after his arrest, the situation still had a serious flaw. Even though it might have looked evident what had happened to Sierra, her body had yet to be discovered. Could they really accuse Annalyn of first-degree murder in the absence of a body or a death that had been verified? Yes, in reality. Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen said on May 19, 2014, that he would be requesting the death penalty against Annalyn, although Annalyn had previously entered a plea of not guilty to killing Sierra. There was little to no room for error given the overwhelming body of evidence that pointed to his guilt. All the way to the end, after being delayed, Annalyn's trial finally got underway on January 30, 2017. The trial was drawn out and stressful for all parties, with long arguments from the prosecution and defense during the more than 13 weeks of testimony. The defense team for Annalyn tried to argue that his exposure to pesticides from surrounding fields as a child may have psychologically affected his cognitive capacities, and therefore, the crime was not his fault. They considered this to be an interesting aspect of the trial. Additionally, they argued that he shouldn't be eligible for the death penalty because he had nothing to do with the toxic exposure. And under those circumstances, they claimed that this was a deficit he faced, which other people did not. In a last-ditch effort, Annalyn's defense team asked for a new trial after casting doubt on the reliability and honesty of the chief investigator and asserting that he had tampered with evidence in the past. This motion, though, was turned down. The jury convicted Annalyn Garcia Torres of Sierra Lamar's first-degree murder. On May 9, 2017, the evidence was so overwhelming against Annalyn that he was unable to escape responsibility for his acts, even though Sierra's body has never been located and her death has not been proven. Sierra's mother addressed him directly in court and declared, "I find it inconceivable to do a horrific, violent crime. You have hurt both our family and your family deeply. You have taken away from Sierra what God has in store for her, but you also have the option to repent and let us know where she is. I often reflect on her and what has been taken away from me as a mother. Simply put, it's difficult to accept that this took place, though it's reality. I still assume it's a dream when I wake up every morning." As numerous of Sierra's kin read letters to him in the courtroom, Annalyn remained quiet and motionless, and he has continued to insist that he is innocent. It follows that he has never said where Sierra's body might be, and regrettably, nobody knows what exactly happened to her on the day that she vanished. Outside the evidence offered, Annalyn was formally given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, after being spared the death penalty. Since his sentencing, Annalyn has remained largely silent and, despite receiving hundreds of letters from news organizations and total strangers, has only answered one letter. In this letter, Annalyn wrote, "I maintain my innocence, and I'm not going to discuss the matter." This letter is sent to a news reporter from Crone 4. "I do not trust the news, as there is a lot of selective reporting that presents an often inaccurate picture. Like many others, I believe everyone has a right to be heard, but sadly, those times are long gone." Actually, I'm not sure why Annalyn continues to maintain his innocence, as this is as obvious as day because of his DNA on Sierra's possessions, Sierra's DNA in his car, his prior criminal history, and a precise timeline. At least it was crystal clear that he was involved in Sierra's disappearance. There is no way she would still be missing if she were still alive, claim friends and family. Over a period of 3 years, volunteers carried out over 100 searches within a 15-meter radius, putting in a combined 50,000 man-hours of search effort in search of any information about the missing young woman. Even now, volunteers continue to search desperately for Sierra Lamar. The majority of them are aware that Sierra is probably deceased, but they still want to return her to her family and provide them with the closure they need. Nobody is certain where Sierra's body may be at this time, but hopefully, one day the Lamar family will receive the closure they seek. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Katie Sepich. On the morning of August 31, 2003, the lifeless body of 22-year-old Katie Sepich was discovered near a remote landfill in the desert of Las Cruces, New Mexico. She had last been seen by friends as she left a local house party, following a night of bar hopping. It would take almost 4 years to identify her killer. Katie, a 22-year-old woman, was described by her mom as outspoken, vivacious, and intelligent. She grew up in Carlsbad, New Mexico, as the oldest of 3 siblings. After graduating with a business degree from New Mexico State University, she was planning to start graduate school in the fall to pursue her MBA. At the time, Katie worked as a waitress at a local Mexican restaurant. Katie was an extremely outgoing individual who formed a close bond with a guy named Joe Bischoff while attending university. Initially, their connection was platonic, but it soon blossomed into romance. Katie confided in her mother, Jeanne, about her deep-seated happiness with Joe and her desire to forge a long-term partnership with him. A short while later, Joe presented her with a diamond engagement ring. After graduating from university in the summer of 2003, Katie and Joe's relationship faced challenges. While Katie opted to pursue further studies at the university, Joe moved back to his parents' place in Gallup, New Mexico, a small city approximately 350 miles away from Las Cruces. Katie was devastated when Joe had to depart. Although their long-distance relationship was extremely challenging, they still found ways to reunite occasionally. During the Labor Day weekend of 2003, Joe visited Las Cruces, and Katie was ecstatic. Sadly, their brief time together took a tragic turn. On Saturday, August 30th, 2003, Katie spent the evening with Joe and their friends, bar hopping before heading to a local house party. However, after the party, Katie vanished. The following day, Katie's mom, Jan, received a life-changing phone call. As a mother, Jane cherished Katie, her remarkable, outgoing, vibrant, and intelligent daughter, who always lit up the room with her infectious laughter. Katie's roommate was on the other end of the line, desperately seeking Jane's help in locating Katie, having already contacted all her friends and local hospitals, but to no avail, with no sign of Katie anywhere. Veronica, who shared a room with Katie, informed Jana that Katie had departed from the party by herself that evening. Although Veronica and Joe had assumed Katie had gone home, they fell asleep at the party venue, only to discover the next morning that she was missing. Katie's family subsequently contacted the police to report her disappearance. Around the same time, a partially clothed female body was found near a desert landfill. Although there was no identification nearby, police officers who responded to the scene determined that the body had been there for less than 24 hours. It was clear to them that the woman's death was not accidental. The victim was estimated to be between 20 and 25 years old, and her partial nudity, from the waist down, suggested that the motive behind the crime was likely sexual. She had defensive wounds on her arms, suggesting she fought back against her attacker and scratched them in the process. The police found skin cells from the assailant under her fingernails, which provided a crucial DNA sample. There were also signs of strangulation on her neck, indicating this was likely the cause of her death. Despite this, there was no evidence of a struggle at the scene where the body was found, leading investigators to believe she died elsewhere. It appeared the killer moved her body to the remote desert landfill in an attempt to delay its discovery. On the victim's body, another shocking discovery was made. Burn marks were found on her arms and back. These marks suggested that the perpetrator attempted to either dispose of the body or destroy evidence, and in doing so, they intentionally set the victim on fire. The police quickly linked Katie's disappearance to the discovery of a young woman's body. Katie's father then went to the mortuary to identify the body. According to Katie's mother, Jeanne, after a few hours of agonizing uncertainty, their worst fears were confirmed. The body was indeed Katie's. The pain was overwhelming, and they were consumed by grief. They felt trapped in a desperate situation with no escape, as if all happiness and hope had been lost, leaving no future ahead. Katie's father was required to identify the body of his beloved daughter. He later recounted to the investigators that when they pulled back the sheet, revealing her bruised and contorted face, he was overcome with emotion, dropped to his knees, and prayed to God to take his own life, overwhelmed by grief. The residents of Las Cruces, once a peaceful place, were left horrified by the traumatic event that befell Katie. With a sense of urgency, the police launched an extensive investigation to apprehend the perpetrator as quickly as possible, largely driven by the fear that this individual might strike again. To better understand Katie's case, the police started by reconstructing the final hours of her life. They sought to establish her whereabouts, her companions, and her activities during that time, as well as whether she had any altercations or enemies. Since the party venue was approximately a mile from Katie's home, the police had to ascertain whether she had managed to return home safely. The investigators' first interviews were with Veronica, Katie's roommate, and Joe, her boyfriend. It struck them as odd that these two had stayed at the party while Katie had departed alone in the middle of the night. Joe displayed a lack of willingness to cooperate with the police, stating that Katie had left the party of her own accord and had intentionally left behind her purse, phone, and keys. The detectives thoroughly examined Katie's route, conducting a door-to-door inquiry and speaking with local residents. But regrettably, no one witnessed or overheard anything unusual. A promising lead indicated that Katie had arrived at her house but failed to enter, as she had departed without her keys. The investigators conducted a thorough search of the house and its surroundings, discovering Katie's shoes outside her bedroom window. It seemed that she had attempted to re-enter the house through the window, but was suddenly attacked. The footprints in the gravel beside the house supported this theory. Katie had put up a fierce fight for her life, but unfortunately, her attacker proved to be stronger. The investigators proposed that after killing Katie, the perpetrator transported her body to the desert landfill and attempted to burn it. They started questioning whether the perpetrator was a stranger or someone Katie knew and trusted. Since around 40 people had attended the party, the investigators looked into the possibility that someone might have trailed Katie when she went home and attacked her, possibly even her boyfriend Joe. When the police questioned Joe again, they told him they were aware that he and Katie had a dispute because she caught him kissing another girl. Joe confirmed this was true and stated that after Katie left, he followed her in his car, but he didn't enter her home because he saw her bedroom light was off and thought she was asleep. So he went back to the party. The investigators stumbled upon another peculiar aspect of Joe's behavior. After leaving the party, he frequently dialed Katie's cell phone, which was still in her purse, and persisted in doing so until morning. The question was whether Joe was attempting to establish an alibi for himself or feigned concern for Katie's well-being. The investigators wanted Joe to explain his suspicious behavior, but he refused to cooperate with them any further. Despite loving Joe deeply, Katie's family was shocked when he failed to attend her funeral, which only fueled their suspicions. In the end, the investigators only needed one thing to clear Joe's name: a DNA sample. Experts discovered DNA samples at 3 different locations on Katie's body, with most of it located under her fingernails. The DNA was identified as human skin cells. Notably, all the DNA samples found on Katie's body came from the same individual. The police were keen to compare Joe's DNA with the DNA recovered from Katie's body, but they faced obstacles in doing so. At the time, Joe was out of town, and his parents had hired a lawyer who informed the investigators that Joe had declined to provide a DNA sample for testing. It was clear to everyone that Joe was hiding something and was likely involved in Katie's death, judging by his behavior. The police were convinced of his guilt, but they needed to find a legal way to obtain his DNA to confirm their suspicions, which took some time. At the same time, investigators were examining alternative explanations. They were researching similar crimes to determine if Katie was the sole victim of whoever ended her life. The DNA samples discovered on her body were compared to a national database, but no matches were found. The investigators went back to the starting point of their inquiry, the party where everything began. They managed to track down all the male guests who had attended the party and requested that each of them provide a DNA sample. Every single one of them complied, since they claimed to have nothing to conceal. Nevertheless, the results of the DNA analysis did not yield any matches with the DNA traces found on Katie's body. This lack of a match led the investigators to refocus their attention on Joe, the solitary individual who had declined to provide his DNA sample. The investigators discovered an alternative approach. Prior to attending the party, Katie and Joe had spent time in her bedroom, where they had been physically intimate. The police subsequently visited the house and collected the sheet from Katie's bed, suspecting they might find Joe's DNA on it. Their hunch proved correct. The laboratory analysis did reveal a sample of male DNA, but it did not correspond to the DNA found on Katie's body. This meant that Joe was not the perpetrator who attacked her. If Joe wasn't involved in what happened to his girlfriend, why did he initially refuse to cooperate with the police? Once the police sent the test results to his lawyer, Joe discovered he had been cleared as a suspect. Following this, Joe changed his mind and decided to talk to the police again, even providing a DNA sample. The new test results confirmed the initial finding. Joe was innocent of the crime. Joe refused to cooperate with the police because he had previously had intimate contact with Katie before the party, and he feared they would discover his DNA on her body. Despite their best efforts, the police and Katie's family couldn't understand Joe's behavior on the night of her death. After Joe was cleared as a suspect, the police had to explore alternative theories. Several partygoers informed the investigators that Katie was wearing rings on her fingers that night, including one given to her by Joe. However, when Katie's body was found, her fingers were bare. The police suspected that the killer had removed the rings. They searched all local pawn shops, but failed to find Katie's stolen jewelry. Near where Katie's body was discovered, another potential lead emerged in the form of tire tracks. Forensic experts successfully identified the brand and model of the tires in question. Upon contacting the manufacturer, the police learned that these specific tires are typically fitted to pickup trucks. Regrettably, this new information failed to bring the authorities any closer to catching the perpetrator, and the case ultimately stalled. About a year after Katie's incident, a similar crime occurred in Wisconsin. In Green Bay, a girl was attacked and suffered the same brutal fate as Katie. She was also set on fire, but miraculously, she managed to survive. The victim credited her survival to feigning death, which led the attackers to leave her. Once they were gone, she put out the flames and sought help at a nearby residence. She claimed to have been attacked by two Hispanic males, but the evidence in Katie's case suggested only one perpetrator was involved. To determine if there was a link between the two crimes, DNA analysis was necessary. The victim from Wisconsin provided a detailed description of her attackers to the police. When the Green Bay police released the composite sketches, a local farmer recognized the men as his employees, Gregorio Morales and Juan, since one of them had relatives in Las Cruces and often visited them. As a result, both men were arrested, and the police investigating Katie's case believed they had finally identified the culprit. However, the results of the DNA examination proved otherwise. The samples did not match the DNA found on Katie's body. These two men were later convicted of assaulting a girl in Green Bay, but they were not connected to the Katie case. Morales was sentenced to 50 years in prison and Gregorio to 50 years. Thus, the investigators reached another dead end. The only evidence the police had were tire tracks from the crime scene and DNA samples of the perpetrator. Katie's family hoped that DNA would allow the police to identify the person who took their daughter's life, but there were problems with that. It was not legal to take a DNA sample from anyone arrested by the police. Jen, Katie's mom, expressed her surprise and frustration about this. They had lost their daughter to a monster, and they needed justice, to know who had done this and why. And most of all, they needed to know that he would be stopped from doing this again. The detective leading Katie's case informed Jen that the only evidence they possessed was DNA. During her fierce struggle to survive, Katie had managed to collect her killer's blood and skin underneath her fingernails. The police had successfully extracted a DNA profile from this evidence and uploaded it into CODIS, a national forensic database. Detective Jones clarified that every week, this DNA evidence would be automatically cross-checked against the offender database to search for a potential match. This news brought renewed hope to Katie's family, as they were confident that they would eventually identify their daughter's killer once a matching profile was found. Detective Gian casually mentioned that the perpetrator was such a menace he'd likely be arrested again soon, at which point his DNA would be collected and entered into the system, leading to his identification and eventual conviction. However, Detective Jones contradicted him, explaining that this process isn't possible in New Mexico or most other states, as it's against the law to collect DNA samples from someone simply because they've been arrested. 3.5 years after Katie's death, a significant breakthrough occurred in the case on December 18, 2006. A DNA sample was discovered that matched the DNA evidence found on Katie's body. The attacker was identified as 26-year-old Gabriel Avila, a married father of one who had no prior connection to Katie. Notably, Avila had a lengthy criminal history and had been released from prison just shortly before Katie's murder on November 13, 2003. Less than 3 months after killing Katie, Avila was caught and arrested for breaking into an apartment shared by 2 young women carrying a knife. Fortunately, the college roommates managed to avoid an attack by locking themselves in the bathroom and quickly calling the police. In March 2004, Avila was found guilty of aggravated burglary with the intention of committing aggravated assault. However, after being released on bail, Avila fled instead of facing justice. Avila could have been caught and arrested just 3 months after Katie's attack, but due to flaws in the system, it took 3.5 years to establish a connection between him and Katie's death. Avila evaded police for almost a year before being caught in November 2004, thanks to a tip. He received a 9-year prison sentence, and a DNA sample was taken when he entered prison, but it sat untested for another 2 years. When the results finally came back, showing a partial match to DNA from Katie's crime scene, investigators sprang into action, tracking down the truck Avila used to dispose of her body, where they found a ring that belonged to Katie. This case highlights the need for system change. The police wasted resources and time searching for the perpetrator for 3 years, which could have been avoided if they had taken a DNA sample from Avila during his initial arrest. Moreover, it is astonishing that his DNA sample was only tested 2 years later, in 2006. Detectives investigating Katie's case visited Avila in prison after finding her ring in his pickup truck. Avila confessed to the crime, explaining that he had been in the area that night to buy illegal substances while his wife was away. He claimed that he offered Katie a ride when he saw her, but she declined. Later, he saw her again outside her house and stopped to offer help when she said she couldn't get in because she didn't have her purse. Katie tried to climb into her bedroom window, but Avila attacked and undressed her. Unsure what to do next, Avila strangled Katie, fearing she would identify him later. He then put her body in his pickup truck and drove to a desert landfill, where he dumped her body and attempted to set it on fire to destroy evidence, but his plan failed. Avila's DNA sample was recollected, and it matched DNA evidence found on Katie's body from 2003. Her parents were hopeful this new finding would lead to a swift investigation. However, they were shocked to discover that, in New Mexico and nearly every other state, it was illegal to collect DNA samples from individuals upon arrest. Instead, DNA was only entered into the system after someone had been convicted and sentenced to prison. This discovery prompted Katie's parents to launch a nationwide campaign, seeking to pass a law in all 50 states requiring individuals arrested for violent crimes to provide a DNA sample. The DNA would then be added to the CODIS national database, facilitating investigations and potentially solving crimes. In 2006, Katie's law was passed by the New Mexico state legislature with a near-unanimous vote of only 5 dissenting voices, and was subsequently signed into law in March 2006. Following the relentless advocacy of Katie's parents, the legislation was eventually adopted at the federal level in 2010. To date, over 31 states have enacted laws similar to New Mexico's Katie's Law. Katie's father, David, had long feared that another person would suffer the same fate as his daughter at the hands of her killer. But with the law now in place, he can finally find some comfort and relief. Opponents of this policy argue it invades privacy and violates civil rights, while others note that DNA, unlike fingerprints, contains sensitive genetic information. In the case of United States versus Kincaid, a federal district court ruled that collecting DNA samples before conviction and including them in the National DNA Database does not violate constitutional rights. In 2017, Gabriel Avila's trial got underway. During the proceedings, Avila offered a heartfelt apology to Katie's family. His lawyer pleaded with the judge to show mercy, citing Avila's remorsefulness as a mitigating factor. District Attorney Susana Martinez countered that Avila had delayed his confession for over 3 years, only coming forward when confronted with irrefutable DNA evidence by detectives. At the sentencing hearing, Katie's father, David, addressed the judge, imploring him not to be lenient with the punishment. He argued that his family would never have the opportunity to see Katie again, and it was only fair that the person responsible for her death should not be allowed to experience freedom again in their own lifetime. In May 2007, Gabriel Avila was found guilty and received a 69-year prison sentence. He will be eligible for parole in 2043 after serving 30 years of his sentence. Jenna believes that true closure is unattainable, but she is now ready to move forward. She, her husband, and their 2 other children have been healing and progressing with their lives, and they cherish their remaining kids deeply. Additionally, Jenny has pledged that she and her husband will persist in their efforts to have Katie's law enacted in all 50 states as a testament to their deceased daughter. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Autumn Taggart. Autumn Taggart, a single mother, lived in Windsor, a city near the Michigan-Ontario border, with her 9-year-old son Gavin in 2018. Despite her breakup with Gavin's father, Chris Sherwin, they remained on good terms to minimize the impact on their child. On Saturday, June 9, 2018, Autumn and Gavin spent the afternoon with Chris, and after grocery shopping together, he dropped them off at their 3rd-floor apartment. After Chris left, Gavin played video games with his mother before bedtime, unaware of the horrifying night that was about to unfold. Gavin woke up to a noise while it was still dark outside. Startled, he opened his eyes to see a strange man standing close to his bed. The man instructed Gavin to close his eyes and go back to sleep before leaving the room. Gavin knew his mother's room was located behind the wall to the right, as shown in the photo. About a minute later, he heard his mother scream. The boy had never felt such intense fear before. The screaming eventually stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the space. After a few minutes, Gavin fell asleep, overcome with exhaustion. Gavin woke up to find it was already morning. He got out of bed and went straight to his mother's room. He was met with a scene of utter destruction. Everything was smashed and broken. His mother, Autumn, was lying on the bed, but she wasn't asleep. At first, 9-year-old Gavin thought she was just resting, but the blood on her nose told a different story. The reality hit him like a ton of bricks. His mother was dead. Gavin was in denial, refusing to accept the truth. To distract himself from the grim reality, he spent the morning playing video games on his console and watching YouTube videos, trying to avoid the unpleasant fact that his deceased mother was lying in the next room. In the afternoon, Gavin couldn't take the pressure anymore and broke down in tears. He decided to confide in someone, so he went to his mother's room, took her phone, and messaged his father on Messenger. He typed out a desperate message. Autumn wasn't waking up. Chris and his girlfriend quickly got in their car and drove to Gavin and Autumn's home. When they arrived, Chris parked the car and got out, spotting his son standing behind a sliding glass door on the 3rd floor. However, Chris didn't have an electronic key to enter the building, so Gavin came downstairs to let him in. Chris asked his son to wait with his girlfriend while he went to investigate why Autumn wasn't waking up. Chris entered the apartment, proceeded to the bedroom, and was shocked to see Autumn's pale appearance. Her face and body were bruised, and her nose was bloody. He immediately dialed 911. The police and an ambulance arrived at the address he provided, where the paramedics examined Autumn's body and surveyed the signs of struggle in the bedroom. Given the extent of her injuries and the evidence of a fierce fight, they sadly had no option but to pronounce her dead, concluding that it was no accident. Investigators searched the apartment for clues, while a specialist in child interrogation spoke with Gavin, who revealed that an overnight guest had instructed him to go to bed. Gavin recounted hearing his mother's screams, but they abruptly ceased. He provided a description of the man he saw in his room that night, saying he appeared to be a white male of average height with messy hair, resembling someone who had just rolled out of bed. According to Gavin, the man was skinny, but not too skinny. The autopsy concluded that Autumn's death was the result of strangulation. Furthermore, it was discovered that she had been physically assaulted prior to her death, with injuries found in her genital area. Additionally, male DNA samples were recovered from her body. The investigation aimed to address several key questions, including how the perpetrator gained access to the apartment, what motivated the crime, and most crucially, the identity of the individual who had entry to the building, as an electronic key was required for entry. The police quickly ruled out the possibility that the killer was one of the building's residents, since Gavin was familiar with all his neighbors and the man he spotted on the night of the murder was not among them. To commit the crime, the perpetrator would have needed not only an electronic key to access the building, but also a way to enter Autumn's apartment, which presented a problem. There were no signs of forced entry on the door to her apartment, suggesting that either she had let the perpetrator in voluntarily or had failed to lock the door. Eventually, the police abandoned their initial assumptions when they discovered evidence that the perpetrator had accessed the third floor. It emerged that the individual had first climbed up to the second-floor balcony and then made their way to the third floor, where they found the door was already open, allowing them to enter the apartment unimpeded. In addition to the DNA sample, the police also found fingerprints at the scene, which they were working to match to their owner. It wasn't until 12 days after the body was discovered that the police finally released the victim's identity, in the hope that this would lead to new tips from the public. The authorities are seeking anyone with information that could aid the investigation to come forward and contact the detectives. A witness reported seeing a new black SUV, possibly a Honda Pilot, in the parking lot adjacent to the building on the night of the crime. The vehicle was seen in the lot until around 6 a.m. Detectives believe the SUV's owner may have been involved in Autumn's death and hypothesized that the individual used the roof of their car as a stepping stone to climb higher. Specifically, they think the perpetrator exploited the building's decorative protrusions, which resemble steps, to ascend from the second floor to the third. The nighttime crime scene presented an advantage to investigators as most people are asleep then, resulting in fewer mobile phones being active. By analyzing phone activity in Autumn's area, they were able to narrow down the list of active numbers near the crime scene. During the investigation, detectives found that one of the phone numbers belonged to a neighbor of Autumn's, who lived in the same building. Although the neighbor claimed to know nothing about the incident during her police interview, her alibi didn't quite add up. Phone records showed that she had made calls from her apartment and various locations around the city, and her phone was switched off around the time Autumn's life was taken. While it was difficult to pinpoint her exact location due to the margin of error in phone tracking, it was clear that she was being evasive and hiding something from the detectives. So they went to speak with Michelle again. She reiterated that she didn't know anything and hadn't heard anything, but the police subtly warned her that if it was later discovered she had withheld vital information from the investigation, she could be considered an accomplice to the crime. As a result, she began to talk. Michelle said that around 2 a.m. that night, a man known to them as Jay got in touch with her and her boyfriend. Jay was looking to buy illegal drugs and also wanted to hire an escort. The three of them drove to an ATM where Jay withdrew some cash. After that, Michelle and her boyfriend handed over a certain amount of the drug to Jay. Michelle admitted that she and her boyfriend were drug dealers. Later, Jay asked them to sell him more drugs. According to Michelle, she then told Jay to drive to the parking lot near her building. Michelle confessed that she and her boyfriend had planned to rob Jay. Upon arrival at the building, the three individuals ingested illicit drugs. Following this, Michelle and her boyfriend resolved to abscond with the remaining drugs. Prior to their escape, Michelle concealed a bag of the drugs within her genital area. According to Michelle, she and her boyfriend escaped, stealing not just the substance, but also a significant amount of Jay's money. They fled to the building's entrance, then went up to the apartment, where they barricaded themselves inside, sitting silently in the dark. Jay was unable to enter the building since he lacked an electronic key, and he couldn't yell or honk his horn, fearing that someone might alert the police. According to Michelle, when they looked out the window, they noticed shoe marks on the roof of Jay's car. Additionally, a man was seen driving away at approximately 6 a.m. Investigators theorized that Jay must have climbed into the building, attempting to track down those responsible for stealing the substance and money from him. However, as he was unaware of Michelle's residence, it's likely that he inadvertently entered Autumn's apartment by mistake. The police obtained the suspect's phone number and photo from a camera at the bank entrance, where he withdrew cash to buy the substance, and from an ATM camera. Investigators learned that the man's real name was Jitesh Bogle, a 27-year-old Canadian citizen who lived and worked as a car development engineer in Warren, Michigan. He was also the owner of a black Honda Pilot SUV and frequently crossed the river by bridge or tunnel to visit Canada, specifically Windsor, almost daily. Authorities tracked the suspect's movements, discovering he had left Canada on June 10th, the morning Autumn died, and had not returned to the country since. Following the police release of information about the black SUV seen at the victim's house, Jitesh sold his car. Canadian police collaborated with their American counterparts, learning Jitesh planned to relocate from Michigan to Washington State, where his parents resided in Kent. The combination of his decision to move, disposing of the car, and ceasing visits to Canada raised strong suspicions, but the police required concrete evidence to arrest and extradite him to Canada. The Windsor police requested assistance from the U.S. National Security Agency in their investigation and asked them to closely monitor the suspect's activities. DNA evidence found on Autumn's body suggested it belonged to Jitesh, but to confirm this, they needed to obtain a DNA sample from him for comparison. U.S. agents tracked the suspect's every move, aware that he was planning to relocate to Washington State and fearing he might flee to another country. In an effort to alter his appearance, Jitesh shaved his beard and started wearing blue contact lenses. Fortunately for the investigators, Jitesh was reckless. One day, he visited a bar in Warren, where he spent several hours drinking. When he downed his last glass and exited the bar, the agents swiftly seized the glass, thereby obtaining a DNA sample from it. Although it took some time to compare this new sample with the one found on Autumn's body, the outcome was not unexpected. The male DNA discovered on the victim's body was identified as a match to Jitesh Bogle's DNA. On August 17, 2018, nearly 2.5 months following Autumn Taggart's tragic demise, Jitesh was taken into custody at his parents' residence in Kent, Washington, a development that caught him off guard, as he appeared to believe the authorities would be unable to locate him. The U.S. authorities promptly initiated the extradition process to have him returned to his native country. In the supporting extradition documents, the prosecutor underscored Jitesh's perceived threats to public safety, his high risk of fleeing, and his unpredictable nature. Soon after, Canadian authorities charged him with the murder of Autumn Taggart. Due to pandemic-related restrictions, the trial was delayed for an extended period. However, it finally began in November 2021. To maintain social distancing, the proceedings took place in 3 separate courtrooms: the main courtroom, where the judge, prosecutor, jury, and the defendant with his defense team were seated, and 2 additional courtrooms equipped with large screens broadcasting the trial to Autumn's family members and other observers. Jitesh Bogle denied committing first-degree deprivation of life, claiming he unintentionally killed Autumn. He explained that earlier, some thieves stole money and drugs from his car, leaving him upset. After consuming a large amount of alcohol and substances, he got out of the vehicle to search for the thieves. Due to his intoxication, he didn't recall many events from that night. However, he remembered climbing onto the balcony and entering the apartment where Autumn was sleeping, mistakenly thinking she was Michelle, the woman who had robbed him. When Autumn awoke and started screaming, he ordered her to be quiet, but she disobeyed. In response, he covered her mouth, which led to her suffocation. Only after the screaming stopped did Jitesh realize he had accidentally taken Autumn's life, and he attempted to perform CPR on her, but it was too late. Jitesh had no memory of how Autumn's genital injuries occurred or how he left her apartment. His lawyers requested that the first-degree life imprisonment charges be dropped, arguing that the crime was not premeditated. They believed Jitesh was unaware of his actions due to the large quantity of substances he had consumed. The fact that he placed his hand over Autumn's mouth suggests he wanted her to be quiet, not dead. According to defense lawyer Peter Thorning, Jitesh lacked the capacity to form intent or understand the consequences of his actions. Thorning claimed that intoxication was the sole explanation for Jitesh's behavior, and that sometimes tragic events occur without intending the outcome. He stated that Autumn's death was not intentional, and that Jitesh was either too intoxicated to realize his actions could cause death or did not appreciate the consequences. Jitesh's lawyers argued that there was no evidence to suggest the defendant had sexual intercourse with the victim. Although Jitesh's DNA was found on Autumn's body, it was not seminal fluid, according to the lawyers. They suggested that the DNA could have been transferred through cross-contamination, where DNA is accidentally transferred from one surface to another, possibly through the forensic expert's gloves. The defense team attempted to convince the jury that John Lort, a forensic expert involved in the investigation, had botched his job and inadvertently transferred Jitesh's DNA to Autumn Taggart's body. As part of his role, Lort was responsible for photographing the crime scene and collecting evidence that came into direct contact with the victim. Jitesh's defense lawyer, Peter Thorning, questioned Lort about the possibility of DNA or fluid transfer from the body to the bed sheet or vice versa during the manipulation of the body, which is a known phenomenon referred to as cross-contamination. Lort stated during cross-examination that he changed gloves between handling each piece of evidence and using his camera to take photographs, thus preventing cross-contamination. In his examination of evidence in Taggart's room, Lort searched for bodily fluids such as urine, saliva, and semen, as he explained that in cases involving a deceased female victim, the likelihood of sexual assault is higher compared to cases involving a male victim. Lort testified to the court that he did not find any fluid evidence consistent with sexual assault. He acknowledged that his examination of the body was limited, as he was not a trained medical professional, such as a coroner. Lort testified that there were no obvious signs of a struggle at Autumn's apartment, such as broken furniture or glass, forced entry, tampered locks, or blood spatter. In contrast, the prosecutor believed that the defendant's actions constituted a search for hidden substances, similar to how Michelle had hidden them in her genital area. The prosecutor argued that the defendant committed sexual assault by searching Autumn's body in the same way, regardless of whether he used his hand. When questioned by the prosecutor about why he didn't call 911 when Autumn stopped breathing, Jitesh disagreed, saying he didn't think it was necessary. Jitesh responded that he feared the police would arrest him because he knew nobody would take his word for it. He could hardly believe his own story, as he recounted in his testimony. Jitesh acknowledged that his memory of the events in Autumn's room was hazy. However, he did recall performing CPR on Autumn after she had stopped screaming. Previously, he had testified that he remembered counting 5 or 6 ribs down before starting CPR, and that he had done 15 compressions accompanied by 3 breaths. The prosecutor also challenged the defendant's claim that the strangulation of the victim was accidental. He pointed out that if the defendant simply wanted to silence Autumn, he could have covered her mouth with his hand. Instead, he also pinched her nose shut, which deliberately prevented her from breathing. Moreover, he sustained this grip for a period of time, indicating that he was fully aware of his actions. Chris Sherwin, Autumn Taggart's former partner and the father of their son, was the last person to hear from her via text message around 12:30 a.m. on June 10th. After sending a follow-up text and receiving no response, he grew concerned. It wasn't until later that day that he received a text from Autumn's phone, only to discover it was their son responding. The court displayed a copy of these text messages for the jury to review on December 1st, 2021. Following deliberation, the 12-person jury found Jitesh Bogle guilty of depriving Autumn of her life. Despite allegations, they found no convincing evidence that Jitesh had engaged in sexual intercourse with Autumn. Autumn's father, John Tager, expressed relief and gratitude for the verdict, stating, "Can't say we weren't nervous, but it's definitely the right verdict. Autumn deserved this. Her son deserved this. Justice. That's what we wanted. That's what we got." The family members were visibly relieved, hugging each other in celebration. On January 5th, 2022, the court sentenced Jitesh Bogle to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 25 years before he is eligible for parole. Jitesh appeared in court via video from jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a black mask. During the victim impact statements, he sat quietly against the wall, distant from the camera. When given the opportunity to speak, he expressed remorse, saying, "It's hard to express the sorrow and remorse I feel. I am happy for the family that they have a sense of justice, and they can move on. Part of my soul died that day as well." Autumn's father, John Tager, reiterated his desire for Canadian laws to change, stating, "We'd still like to see the laws in Canada change for life sentences to actual life, not 25 years and then parole. We'd like life to mean life for all victims." Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Amanda Plass. Amanda Lynn Pla was born on December 11, 1990, in Chappie, Massachusetts. She grew up there with her siblings, Emily and Nicholas. According to her mother, Michelle Myers, Amanda was a free spirit, often jokingly told that she was born in the wrong generation. In 2011, Amanda worked as a waitress at Friendly's in Chappie. At the time, she was dating 27-year-old Seth Green, a carpenter. On August 26, 2011, Seth called 911, frantic and crying, reporting that he had found Amanda unresponsive on the kitchen floor of her third-floor apartment. He described her as already unconscious, with multiple wounds visible on her body. Seth was in shock, asking the operator to send both the police and an ambulance. When paramedics responded to the emergency call, they found Amanda deceased from multiple stab wounds, including injuries to her chest, throat, and abdomen. The police promptly secured the crime scene, cordoning off the house where the incident occurred. Upon their arrival, officers encountered Seth on the porch, visibly distraught and in a state of shock. A thorough search of Amanda's apartment was conducted by detectives who sought to gather evidence from the crime scene. Although the perpetrator had fled the scene, they left behind crucial clues. Initial observations revealed a substantial amount of blood splatter in the kitchen, leading detectives to conclude that the attack had taken place there and that the likely weapon was a knife, which the perpetrator had taken with them. Furthermore, police discovered visible shoe impressions from Nike sneakers on the floor and broken glass in the room, where a palm print was also found. The brutal crime's motive remained a mystery, but detectives suspected Amanda knew her attacker and that personal animosity drove the crime, given the nature and number of wounds on her body. Consequently, the primary suspect was Amanda's boyfriend, Seth Green, who was taken to the police station for questioning. Amanda's death was a devastating shock to her family, with her mother, Michelle Mathis, struggling to come to terms with the severity of the situation. Sadly, Amanda's death was not the only heartache her family would have to endure, a topic that will be explored further in due course. As I mentioned earlier, the police took Seth Green in for questioning, which wasn't surprising given the circumstances. He was the obvious first suspect, being Amanda's boyfriend, with blood stains on his clothes, and the one who had dialed 911. It transpired that he and Amanda had started dating less than 2 weeks prior to her death, and her family knew very little about him. Although he was 7 years older and might have had differing views on certain matters, it was unclear whether this could have led to an argument that escalated into a brutal crime. The investigators naturally considered the possibility that Seth might have committed the crime, claiming Amanda was already dead when he arrived at her apartment. They established that a 2-hour window existed between Seth's 911 call and Amanda's death. This time frame would have allowed him sufficient opportunity to destroy evidence and dispose of the murder weapon. Consequently, the detective's primary question was whether Seth Green was responsible for Amanda's death. Seth appeared at the police station, visibly shaken and distraught, overcome with grief over the loss of his girlfriend. His tears flowed freely, prompting the investigators to wonder whether his emotional display was genuine or an attempt to divert suspicion from himself. During the interrogation, Seth explained that he had been at work all day and had planned to drive Amanda to the restaurant where she was employed, but his own work commitments had prevented him from doing so. Although their relationship was relatively new, Seth claimed that he had strong feelings for Amanda and had no motive to harm her. Seth was a carpenter at a construction site. The investigators questioned him about the tools he used for work, implying that he might have used one of them to commit a crime. As a carpenter, Seth wore a tool belt on the job, which held various carpentry tools, including a knife. However, he claimed that he always left the tool belt at the construction site after his shift, and this particular day was no different. After finishing his work, Seth changed out of his work clothes, left his tools behind, and went to meet Amanda. Seth was the prime suspect in his girlfriend's death, but he maintained his innocence. Ultimately, the police verified his alibi. He even passed a polygraph test. The construction boots he wore when they arrived didn't match the Nike sneaker prints found at the crime scene. Furthermore, his shoe size was significantly larger than the prints, and the palm print on the glass didn't belong to him either. Considering all the evidence, the police cleared Seth's name. Amanda had put up a fierce fight, so the attacker must have had scratches. In the weeks following the crime, the police found skin particles under Amanda's nails, which they thought would lead to a breakthrough. Unfortunately, after testing the DNA sample, they couldn't find a match in any of their databases. The motive behind the crime remains unclear. Although there were valuable items in Amanda's room that could have been targeted in a robbery, they were left untouched. Moreover, the police did not find any signs of forced entry. There are two possible explanations for how the perpetrator gained access. Either Amanda knew the person and let them in voluntarily, or she might have accidentally left the door unlocked. Amanda's colleagues and friends were interviewed by investigators, who discovered that the crime might have stemmed from a love triangle. Prior to Amanda dating Seth, she was in a relationship with another man, but their breakup was acrimonious. According to those familiar with the situation, Amanda initiated the breakup, and her ex-boyfriend was reportedly unhappy about it. Unrequited love often drives people to make rash decisions that have devastating consequences. As a result, the investigators looked into this lead, but ultimately found nothing. Amanda's ex-boyfriend provided his DNA and fingerprints, neither of which matched the samples found under Amanda's fingernails or on the broken window glass in her room. Moreover, he had a solid alibi. The police explored various leads, but none led to a breakthrough in solving Amanda's murder. As a result, the investigation stalled. Determined to seek justice, Amanda's family took matters into their own hands. They distributed flyers and sponsored car races, hoping someone would come forward with crucial information. Michelle, Amanda's mother, acknowledged that her daughter was not faultless, but she couldn't fathom why someone would take her life and why no one was willing to cooperate with the police. However, Amanda's family soon faced another distressing challenge. They discovered that several police officers had taken photos of Amanda's body with their personal phones and shared them with others, including civilians. According to the police internal affairs report, Sergeant Keith Lame, a senior officer responsible for securing the 73 School Street apartment where Amanda was fatally stabbed on August 26, 2011, was among those who took the photos. He emailed the image from his cell phone to another police sergeant, who then passed it to a patrolman. The officer subsequently shared the photo with civilians, including coaches at a youth football game. Records reveal that Lame captured a photo using his cell phone. He subsequently sent it to Sergeant Jeffrey Godare, who then forwarded the image via email to Patrolman Chad Levesque. For unknown reasons, Officer Levesque chose to share the disturbing photo of homicide victim Amanda lying on her kitchen floor with other football coaches. Captain William Jebb, the internal affairs officer, reported that the photos were shown to at least 3 coaches at a youth football game in Agawam the day after the homicide. Around the same time, Patrolman Terry Deck, responsible for logging all apartment activity for state police, took a photo of Amanda's body and sent it to 6 Chicopee police officers via individual emails. The investigation found that all 6 officers deleted the emails without reporting them, and no disciplinary action was taken against them. Their names were not mentioned in the records. The rest of the officers involved faced consequences for incompetence and failing to meet work standards. Deck and Lame, who took the photos, received formal reprimands, while Godare and Levesque were punished with 3 unpaid shifts. Following Amanda's stepfather's call to the police on September 28, 2011, an internal investigation was launched. His friend had claimed to have seen photos of the crime scene, which had taken place a month earlier. Despite their best efforts, it wasn't until about 2 years later that a breakthrough was finally made in the case. The investigators re-examined all the evidence to determine if they had overlooked any crucial details. In Amanda's bedroom, a previously unseen clue caught their attention on a dry erase board. The handwritten message read, "Dennis was here, 8/11, which became significant since it was dated only 15 days prior to Amanda's body being discovered in her apartment. What was striking was that this critical piece of evidence had been in plain sight the entire time, yet nobody had noticed it until now. It wasn't until investigators started asking around that they realized they didn't know who Dennis was. The name didn't come up at all during the entire investigation. So detectives decided to dig deeper, scouring Amanda's phone records and social media posts to see if she had any connections to someone by that name. They also interviewed her friends, family, and coworkers, and that's when Amanda's ex-boyfriend shared some interesting information. He told them that Amanda's apartment had been broken into several times when she wasn't home, and that she suspected a young Puerto Rican man whose name started with the letter D. Amanda had tried to handle the situation calmly, as she knew the guy, and had even met with him to talk about the break-ins. However, when she brought it up, he denied any involvement. Amanda then revealed that a neighbor had seen him in her apartment and politely asked him to return her stolen belongings. But the guy got defensive and stormed out. Now, one of the most crucial tasks for the investigators was to find out who Dennis was and whether he was the one who took Amanda's life. They discovered that at the time of the crime, a man named Dennis Rosa Roman lived just 3 blocks from the house where Amanda died. A background search on Rosa Roman revealed a history of breaking and entering. However, there was no palm print to compare to the one they found at Amanda's home. The police located Dennis in Westfield, Massachusetts, and requested that he come to the station for an informal talk, but he refused. When they spoke with him, he appeared extremely nervous and agitated. However, in November 2013, 22-year-old Rosa Roman unexpectedly showed up at the police station. The police inquired about Dennis's relationship with Amanda, and although Dennis acknowledged knowing Amanda from their hometown, he claimed he hadn't seen her in a couple of years. His response was plausible, given that Amanda had died 2 years prior. Next, investigators asked if he had ever visited Amanda's apartment, and Dennis replied that he had never been there, saying he didn't know her well at all. He revealed that he occasionally sold Amanda marijuana, explaining that these were the rare instances when their paths crossed. During the interrogation, Rosa Roman consented to provide a DNA sample from his mouth and disclose his shoe size, which matched the shoes found at the crime scene. The officers observed that Rosa Roman was wearing Nike Air Max shoes, the same brand as the footwear documented in the bloody tracks at the crime scene, but with a different tread pattern. After providing his DNA, Rosa Roman declined to answer further questions from the investigators, promising to return to the police station in a few days to continue the conversation. At that point, the police had no grounds to detain him, so he was released. There were concerns that he might flee, which could have stalled the investigation. Amanda's phone records revealed that she had 9 conversations with Dennis on July 28, 2011. The records indicated that Amanda initiated 4 of these calls, while Dennis made 5 calls to her. Later, Rosa Roman returned to the police station, having kept his promise. However, he altered his approach, claiming that he occasionally communicated with Amanda. He alleged that Amanda had confided in him about someone breaking into her apartment on multiple occasions when she was not present. According to Rosa, Amanda didn't report these incidents to the police because the perpetrator didn't steal anything of value. At this stage, the investigators had heard the break-in story multiple times and were almost convinced that Rosa Roman was responsible, entering Amanda's apartment when she was away. They were increasingly suspicious that the man was concealing information, and they couldn't find an alternative explanation for his altered testimony. The only remaining questions were what he was hiding and how he was connected to Amanda's death. When investigators presented Rosa Roman with the photo of the dry erase board featuring the message, "Dennis was here on 8/11/11, he suddenly recalled writing it, contradicting his earlier claim that he had never entered Amanda's apartment. The DNA test results proved he had provided false testimony, as his DNA matched the samples found under Amanda's fingernails, and the palm print on the glass was also identified as his. This conclusive evidence established a direct link between Rosa Roman and the crime. After realizing the police had gathered enough evidence for his arrest, Rosa Roman altered his testimony for the 3rd time. He now asserted he was present at the crime scene and attempted to rescue Amanda from her attacker, suggesting someone else was involved. When investigators pressed him to identify the perpetrator, Rosa Roman declined, supposedly fearing for his family's safety and his own. Nevertheless, he provided specific details about the individual who allegedly took Amanda's life. The suspect, according to Rosa Roman, was tall, white, light-skinned, blue-eyed, and weighed between 170 and 200 pounds. He wore old pants, dirty boots, and a t-shirt with the phrase, "Why drink and drive when you can smoke and fly," emblazoned on it. Despite Dennis's testimony, detectives remained skeptical, as all the evidence suggested that only one person was present when Amanda was stabbed. Rosa Roman was subsequently arrested and charged with Amanda's murder. The trial commenced nearly 3 years later, in 2016. Rosa Roman's attorneys presented a defense that their client was indeed present at the crime scene, but they maintained he was not the perpetrator of Amanda's murder. Moreover, they alleged that the police conducted a flawed investigation, suggesting that they wrongly accused Dennis of the crime after an unsuccessful inquiry. The defense team pointed out that despite having all the necessary information, it took the police 2 years to confront Dennis. Rosa Roman stated that on the day Amanda died, he was forced by his drug dealer to accompany the dealer to Amanda's apartment, supposedly because Amanda owed the dealer around $500 or $600. The dealer demanded his money, so he took Rosa Roman to Amanda's apartment, where the situation escalated out of control. The dealer pulled out a knife and began stabbing Amanda. Rosa Roman claimed he wanted to intervene and help Amanda, but was unable to stop the dealer. At one point, Amanda grabbed his hand, which is why his DNA was left under her nails. However, the prosecutors had a different account of events. They thought Rosa Roman had broken into Amanda's apartment when she was away during one of his illegal intrusions. On one of these occasions, he left a message with his name on the board, which Amanda correctly suspected was written by the trespassing Rosa Roman. This led her to call him, demanding he return what he had stolen, resulting in 9 phone calls between Amanda and Rosa Roman. On the day of Amanda's death, Rosa Roman broke into her apartment again, thinking she would be at work, but Amanda was home, and a violent argument ensued, ending with Rosa Roman taking Amanda's life. After 8 days of testimony and 5 hours of deliberation, a 12-person jury found Rosa Roman guilty of causing Amanda's death in July 2016. The court then sentenced Roman to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The internal audit of the police officers was delayed for many years. Finally, in 2018, Jeffrey Gadir was fired from the police force, but he appealed and was allowed to return to service in 2020. The commission ruled that he would be demoted to patrolman because of his misconduct and prior disciplinary record. On August 4, 2022, Massachusetts passed Amanda's Law, making it illegal for first responders to take unauthorized photographs of crime scenes. Violating this law is a misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in jail and/or a $2,000 fine. Prior to the law's passage, Amanda's family had sued the city of Chelmsford, eventually agreeing to a $100,000 settlement. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Addition and unavailability. The neighbor found the front door unlocked, and upon entering the bedroom, discovered life. The investigation was slow going, and it's unclear how it would have turned out if Christina's family hadn't been active to go to work. He also frequently complained about her nagging him. One of Harris's co-workers believed that Harris might have told the police that he had expressed a wish for Christina to be dead. He described Harris and Christina's relationship as toxic, recalling that they frequently argued. One of the most astonishing aspects of this case was Jason Harris's openness about wanting to get rid of her. Worker testified that Harris had told him he wanted Christina to stop nagging him, but the morning, he sent a text to a neighbor asking her to check on his wife Christina because she wasn't answering his calls. $30,000 death benefit from his employer's life insurance policy soon after Christina's death. One of Harris' people, and learn the jargon that's coming at you from the professionals. You are your loved one's best advocate. Jason Harris was given the opportunity to address the court, but he failed to apologize or express remorse. Instead,